So, Tim, you've been, uh, I think, nice enough, kind enough, and I'm so grateful that you read chapter three of my book, Crossing the Threshold. Maybe reread it, and I think having my work, my writing read by someone who I've been in such intimate dialogue with for so long now is a bit, it's terrifying actually because you're really seeing the letter by letter, word by word, sentence by sentence structure of my thinking process that I've left there. Um, it makes me feel vulnerable to know that like you're in there, but I trust you, to be able to understand what I'm saying, first of all, but also respond to it in a way that's going to be generative for my own thinking. And I'm less interested in defending what I've written, though I might want to clarify things if I feel like it's being misunderstood. I'm much more interested, though, in seeing where thought wants to carry us, and that you've
Mm.
taken the time to read what I've put down on the page there and respond to it is like it's a real gift. And I think that type of dialogue. I mean, we've been dialoguing for a long time, but there's a difference between oral discourse and transaction, and then the written word, which allows us to reach a level of precision and abstraction uh, that accelerates the process of concept creation. And so I'm looking forward to this conversation. Um, to situate it, I just want to say a little bit about what I'm trying to do in that book and then that chapter in particular. Crossing the Threshold is looking at the the place of the imagination in the history of Western philosophy and the role that it has played in both allowing for a form of participatory knowledge of the natural world and the um, cosmogenetic process that we're embedded within, going back to the ancient Greeks and then through to um, the modern period. And I really focus on Kant, of course, and his treatment of imagination in the context of his critical philosophy. And I try to lean on Whitehead and Schelling to not bypass Kant, but to really grapple with and wrestle with Kant and take seriously his the limitations he put on our capacity to know
Mm.
reality. And I think that Kant is such a pivotal moment. Whitehead famously says in the preface of Process and Reality that he found it necessary to recur to pre-Kantian modes of thought, as if he was saying, Kant took such a wrong turn. We need to go back to Hume and Locke and
Mm.
Berkeley and Descartes and rethink things because things really went off the rails after Kant. But at the same time, Whitehead engages with Kant quite deeply, and obviously Schelling is engaging with Kant quite deeply. Um,
Yeah.
and so I'm trying to cross the threshold in the sense of show how a different reading, or maybe an intensified reading of Kant's reading of the imagination, because there are really important suggestions that Kant makes about the power of imagination to lead us into a constructive realism
Mhm,
that you and
mhm,
I are both trying to argue for. Um, but to go through Kant into a view of metaphysics, where I call it, it's a descendental method, so inverting Kant's transcendental method, and it's an aesthetic ontology in the sense that it's overcoming this dichotomy that's running through the whole Western tradition between appearance and reality. And so to say aesthetic ontology is to really, um, I mean, I'm in chapter three intentionally situating this in the context of Nietzsche's fable of the true world, and these stages that he runs through, going back to uh, Plato through Kant, where there's a dialectic between appearance and reality, right? And eventually we get to the point where truth is no longer the correspondence between appearance and reality because there is no transcendent reality. It's all appearance. But then, of course, if there's no transcendent reality, appearance is an appearance, and we enter into a new situation, the end of philosophy, as Nietzsche might put it. But aesthetic ontology is my way of just signaling that rather than thinking that as a dichotomy, aesthesis or perception or appearance, as opposed to what's real, our situation is such that um, it's a perspectivism in Nietzsche's sense that you could say it's appearance all the way down, but appearance is not just a pale imitation of something transcendent. Appearance is a response to what came before. And so what reality is made of is responsiveness to what has come before and anticipation of what might be. But always that might be, the possibility is always in relationship to what already was, you know. That's what I mean by aesthetic ontology. And chapter 3 is trying to take this Whiteheadian and Schellingian view, which I also say is cosmo-theanthropic, um, which is a view that comes from Raimundo Panikkar, wonderful philosopher. He gave the Gifford lectures in like 2006, was it? Called The Rhythm of Being. He comes up with this term cosmotheanthropic, and it's my way of saying, I mean, one of the implications is that we as human beings can't help but be anthropomorphic in our imaginings, in our conceivings, in our perceivings. And we also, I think, can't help but when we imagine, when we conceive, when we sense, we can't help but experience the world as intelligible, as being a cosmos, an order, which doesn't mean there's not also chaos, but we sense and we uh, find our relationship, we find ourselves in relation to an order of some kind. And so cosmotheanthropic means that as human beings, we can't help but imagine that there is an order to the world and that that order has a source. And I think you and I, Tim, and I'll wrap this up with this to throw it over to you. We've found this really, I think, fertile um, tension in our thinking, and I think it concerns the extent to which this inescapable anthropomorphism and even not just anthropomorphism, but uh, cosmotheanthropomorphism that I would want to say is, that we can't help but think in terms of a relationship to the divine. Even if we're atheist, we're in relationship to this idea of the divine. Um, Even if we're agnostic, like we're always constellated around this idea uh, and or reality. I mean, and so um, I think what I do in chapter 3 is bring Whitehead and Schelling's more Neoplatonic and theological panentheist, but still theological view into conversation with Deleuze, Gilles Deleuze, and Friedrich Nietzsche before Deleuze, and John Sallis also, and try to really test what they're up to against the critiques, the hammer that Nietzsche brings, the deconstructive hammer that he brings to traditional ontotheological views um, of the divine and the hierarchy of the great chain of being and all that. And I think, what I hope we can talk about is whether Whitehead and Schelling pass the test. Like, do they survive the Nietzschean underworld unscathed, or do they have to sacrifice some things? And I do think they do have to sacrifice some things, or at least there are readings of Whitehead that wouldn't work if we're going to try to really respond to Nietzsche's
Yeah.
deconstructive movement of thought. So, long introduction. I don't know where you want to go from there, but I wanted to lay that out to provide a frame for this.
Yeah, no, I mean, great introduction, which I won't attempt to do justice to by responding to all of the many points that you brought up. I mean, I can, of course, say at this point that I'm in very broad agreement with practically everything that you've said there. And so the devils emerge as always in the details and in the close reading. Um, and it's a very interesting question that you're asking, whether, what in Whitehead, it's not whether or Whitehead and Schelling survive, I suppose. It's what in Whitehead and Schelling's thought survives. Because obviously I would agree that um, their thought is tremendously useful. Uh, but I'm probably a representative of the more Nietzschean or the more Deleuzian perspective between the two of us. Like my deconstruction is maybe a little bit more uh, thoroughgoing in some sense, but I'm still looking to recover something, right? I'm not saying,
You are a
destruction.
constructive realist after all.
I am indeed. That is a term, one of many terms that I've adopted. So yeah, no, I'm looking to show how that sort of um, deconstructive or indeed constructivist approach doesn't limit us to a kind of relativism or something like that. We won't be completely adrift if we abandon some of the things that perhaps don't survive that encounter with Nietzsche. But even then, it's like what in Nietzsche wouldn't survive the encounter with like a perspective like mine, for example. Nietzsche is very much still, as most philosophers are for very obvious reasons, caught up in this broadly speaking humanist problematic. His thought is very anthropocentric. Um, and I mean, and he's trying to escape anthropomorphism, but the thought remains very anthropocentric. It's very close to very specific, problematics that he is developing from a history of philosophy that, and of course his engagement with Christianity, history of philosophy and religion that he is inheriting and problematizing. But I think
But
there's
I
a
mean, you would admit that Nietzsche is more, uh, I mean, in terms of the thinkers prior to him, I mean, he thought of the human as a rope across an abyss, right? Like, as a transitional species, like
no,
not as the end. So
I totally agree. No, he goes very far.
he's not sufficiently anti-humanist, though, you're saying, or not a post-anthropomorphic, you're saying.
No, he's anti-humanist. That's exactly what he is.
Yeah.
Anti-humanism is merely the shadow of humanism. And
Mm.
so I think there's this very strong anti-humanist strain. And I love a lot of these thinkers, right? So it's very strong in Georges Bataille, right? He's a very strongly anti-humanist thinker. Um, and it's there in Deleuze, obviously, in a big way, and it reaches its, I don't know, I wouldn't want to say apotheosis, but people like Nick Land in a certain phase of his thought. Um, but the thing about that anti-humanism is that it's not a non-humanism in some sense. Like it's not really. See, I would say, and this is my particular bias, which is fairly obvious for anyone that knows me, it's like if you really wanted to think the outside of the human, you should spend a lot of time with like the non-human, agents and organisms in the world and really try to understand what's going on with them. And then maybe you would in fact contextualize or relativize the human more. Um, and I don't see a lot of that in most of these thinkers, is the honest truth,
Mm.
much as I love them. And so this is correlated with the idea in someone like Bataille. And it's not to say that this isn't a very profound idea and very true in some sense, but that the outside of rationalism or the outside of the human intelligibility, that radical alterity that people like Bataille and Deleuze and indeed Schelling and things are obsessed with, but Bataille and in this Nietzschean way and obviously Land in beyond, the way that's associated with a kind of horror um, is all because the thought is always already in that humanist kind of arena, humanism, anti-humanism. The other is something that is because of its numinosity, because of its non pre-subjugated nature. Of course, yes, there might be some degree of celebration of it in those thinkers, like it's the source of it's generative. I mean, this relates to the thesis on the imagination, obviously, but it's a generative ground of some kind. But it is the horror of I mean it is a horror because of our dream of mastery, essentially, right? Like it's putting the death knell, it's sounding the death knell for this idea that human thought can encompass the world, and this is somehow a horrifying thought for a lot of these thinkers. Now they might take they might find it perversely titillating, and you find a lot of that in Bataille and his identification of that outside with eroticism and all of these things. And again, lots of incredibly fertile. Like I'm very enamored of that way of thinking, but there's no real discussion of non-human nature. There's much more in someone like Schelling, actually. Um, but there's no real sustained engagement with non-human nature in someone like Bataille. Very little in Nietzsche. I mean, in Nietzsche, it's like climbing
Mhm.
mountains and there's like a symbolic eagle that flies free and all of that sort of
Yeah.
stuff.
So I like the way you say the anti-humanism is still all too humanist in the sense that Nietzsche was really just focused on human social relations and inquiring into the underbelly of those relations, the things that weren't being included in the Enlightenment humanists' discourse about all these great things that humans can do with their rationality. And Nietzsche's uncovering the hidden shadow dimension of all of that, that will to power. That underlies Descartes' statement that the program for modern science and technology and politics is to become masters and possessors of nature, right?
Yeah,
Um,
yeah. And at the end of that dream again is somehow like an incredible disappointment, and that's where the threat of nihilism arises in
Mhm.
that context.
Yeah,
Like, because we thought that this particular set of symbols of the ultimate were immutable, were indeed
yeah,
ultimate. The fact that they start mutating, or the fact that their presuppositions become apparent to us, their contingency becomes apparent to us, the risk of them falling away risks throwing us into this abyss of nihilism, right?
yeah,
Again, the whole dynamic there is that we had, in a way that I think of as idolatrous, we had erected these ideals, these symbols of the ultimate. Once we see that the immutable is mutable, we feel like the ground has fallen away beneath our feet and there's nothing left for us. But this is essentially because we found our ground in an abstract ideal in the first place, not the actual ground that our embodied selves were walking along.
yeah,
So I
yeah.
think that there's all I'm trying to say, and again, yeah, people, Nietzsche aficionados will talk about lots of stuff in the Nachlass where he does talk about, very beautifully about bare life and various characteristics, and he of course does engage with biology.
The
Um,
episode with the horse when the carriage driver is whipping the horse and he throws himself on the horse.
sure, sure, and obviously that the tragic end to his period of intelligible life or lucid life, yeah. But I guess what I'm trying to say is that I think that there's a real alternative that comes from actual just engagement with other um, agential organismal
Non-humans. Yeah,
non-humans that make meaning, and understanding that the way they live, the way they make meaning, the fact that they have agency and consciousness and whatever, these terms are all very loaded, but
yeah,
and a genealogical account of the human which situates us in amongst
yeah,
those as like a
yeah,
particular lineage of simian evolution, right? um like we're monkeys.
yeah. I mean, this
That
is I think there's so much every time we well, not every time. Sometimes I feel like we disagree more, and other times I hear you and I'm like, I'm on board. We're all actually converging here. Because the way I think about the human, the anthropos, is not as something exceptional
yeah,
or above any other creature or any other organism or even mineral and physical reality. I mean, the human being, I think, okay, so the humus, adama, mud. I
yeah,
don't
yeah,
I don't mean to reach back for the holomorphic metaphors because we want to think otherwise than just using those tired structures. But at the same time, just think of the human as materiality,
yeah, yeah,
mud.
yeah, yeah,
What that means, like the human being's highest potential is to be potentiality, precisely that. In other words, we can
yeah,
mirror the entirety of the rest of the earth and the cosmos. That's what I would hold out as the ideal of the human being, that we're maximally sensitive to everything that is other than us. And that tracks, that's not an anomaly. That's what Pico della Mirandola was saying in his oration on the dignity of man, that we're the one archetype less
yeah,
creature,
yeah,
which makes
yeah,
us potentially capable of allowing all the our other archetypes, all of the other species to inhabit us. And so when we think about what is the essence of the human, it's to be other than
mhm,
oneself. And
yeah.
that might seem like anathema to the tradition, but it's right there in that same tradition. That's what has been being said all along,
Well,
on
in
some
the
level.
yeah, in the esoteric Minority Report version,
Yeah.
uh, which has of course always been there throughout the history of human thought, um, not just Christian thought in the way that you're referring to it now.
Well, this
No,
was, I mean, Pico was recovering Jewish Kabbalah, which I mean, it's still a biblical tradition, but it's not necessarily it's Christianity going to the other, to the Jewish tradition and assimilating and appropriating actually
Yeah,
that
no,
idea.
no, indeed, indeed. And I mean, part of the discussion here is like, how do we, in light of all the things that we have access to, I mean, I don't necessarily want to say in light of all the things that we know, but I could use that term, um, all the information we have about the non-human world today, which is just simply vastly more than anyone has ever had previously. Um, in light of all of that, how do we resituate ourselves and what impact should that knowledge have on our image of ourselves and indeed of the
Yeah.
images we reach for when we are looking for a description of the ultimate or the most general? Because what we're going to get to here is that we have a slight divergence, even though we agree with about so much of this stuff, in the way we think, say, metaphysics or like speculative philosophy should be practiced in terms of what kinds of method, basically, what methodological tools should we reach for. Um, and so what, reading your book, which I love, and it's beautiful. And one of the things I actually love about what you do is the way interleave the kind of diagrammatic with the mythopoetic. But I also, of course, that's one of my primary criticisms, is that there isn't a strong enough distinction being made between what's diagrammatic and what's mythopoetic. And the two, what I think are quite separate discourses, become muddled, and
Mm.
there are reasons for putting them together, obviously, right?
Yeah.
Um, but I think there are a lot of dangers. And if we want to, channeling Peirce, keep our ideas clear,
Mm.
um, we will not combine the discourses in that way, in my opinion, and
Sure.
we will use, and this, maybe we can get to our distinct conceptions of how, because I'm not saying no mythopoetic discourse. I'm not saying no theology. I love mythology. I love poetry. Um, and it has a very rich place. And in fact, what a lot of Western philosophers get from poetry, which is very relevant to your thesis about the imagination.
Mhm.
Um, I'm also saying actually we get that from the encounter with particularity in general, and from that which is not reducible to use value, right? So this is both Eckhart and Bataille.
Mm.
It's like the life beyond why, Eckhart. It's Bataille and the sovereignty or the primordial or primary excessive nature of things. It's Persian in the sense that I'm talking about attending to things in their characters of firstness. All of that, what I have called sacred nominalism or meditation on firstness, all of those sorts of things, which I get from poetry for sure, but in my encounter with nature, with the other, which I am not pre-subjugating to some intelligible framework. With me, I get it from music, I get it from all these things, right? So that has such a huge, that's so important to me. But for very specific reasons, there are separations and distinctions I'm making, which I feel are not. And I'm not saying you have to. I'm not saying I have the right method. I'm just saying I have my reasons for wanting to hold certain things apart. And also, this will relate, and we'll get to it maybe, to why I think Jung's notion of psychic reality is our friend here and is really, really useful, even though Jung's thought is not sufficient to the kind of task that we're setting ourselves, which sounds really hubristic when I put it that way, but uh,
Mhm.
Jungians are champing at the bit right now. But there are so many, and then the issues just become very subtle, really. So it's like if
Yeah.
we always know, and you just referenced it. You and I could have a discussion where we agree on absolutely everything, um, but that's less generative than pointing up what when we're already in this process relational, constructive, ontogenetic mode of thought and all of that, and we are breaking apart and critiquing the various sacred cows of the tradition and all of that. We're doing all of that. But we're both interested in recovering a certain kind of realism. And we're saying there are slightly divergent ways of doing that. And the differences do end up mattering. One of your
Mm.
concerns about my position, and part of the reason we're like, I've returned to your book in our, offline, so to speak, discussions is because I gave this talk on the social contract theory, um, about which I profess no level of expertise, but
Mm.
like the literature on social contract.
Yeah.
Um,
But
but
Thomas Hobbes is such a good example of someone for whom mechanism and materialism are not at all opposed to theism.
yes,
Right.
well, indeed so. Um, and I mean, who has actually a very animate conception of material.
Mhm.
Um, Yeah, but your concern, and I was doing this thing where it was like the title is something like, diverse relations to alterity. So that's Guattari, um, from relational physics to the trans individual. Obviously, the trans individual is Simondon. I didn't get to talk much about that because, as usual, I talk too long about other things and I ran out of time. But the relational physics piece obviously is really important to both of us. And the basic conception here is that there are no things, there are no determinate structures, etc., except those that are formed in relation, right? So there's no like thing of any kind, object of any kind that is just out of relation with other things. Like objectification, Q theory of natural abstraction, is a relational process. It's always occurring in relation. And there's just so many things we can talk about here. Physics as a resource theory, we can bookmark that as something to return to because it's also super relevant to the things you were saying um, earlier. Um, and now I've lost my
But
train. People are going to have to forgive me because I've been very sick recently and I am a little bit all over the place, even more than usual. Um,
yeah, well, that's the thing about metaphysics. Like we want it to be as disinterested as possible, but we are we are embodied minds. We are
yeah,
animal minds. Uh, the food that we eat is not incidentally related to the thoughts that we are capable of having. The health of our bodies is part of our intellectual life, you know.
yeah, yeah. No, very,
Um,
very, very true. Just to finish what I was saying, because I recovered it. You had your concern, having agreed with almost everything I said in that talk, as I understand it, is that the seminar series is supposed to be about the common good. And I was basically saying at the end, like, as in terms of metaphysics, like if we're speaking at the most general level, we can't speak of any determinate common good. The
yeah,
best we could possibly say is like, you know, don't put blocks in the path of inquiry or something like that, which can say, so don't block the ontogenetic process, which can sound like, again, a celebration of deconstruction and destruction for its own sake and blah, 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 which it's not at all. It's not saying that at all, but it's saying that like summarily subjugating to an image of the same or to some preformed structure that you're already in possession of, not allowing the world to work on you. That's not good. And that's pretty much all I can say from my position in
yeah,
terms of define. And your concern, which is a very relevant and real concern that I'm very alive to, is that that doesn't have enough normative heft. That's too thin. We can't organize in light
yeah.
of an idea like that.
Well,
Uh,
metaphysics, I mean, yeah, metaphysics is, as Whitehead says, we're always beginning with something that's given.
mhm.
And he says we find ourselves amidst a democracy of fellow creatures. We find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures. And so when we do metaphysics, um, there's plenty of examples in the history of philosophy where that ends up in a situation where there's some sort of elitist justification for social hierarchy and the imposition of abstract universals upon the particularity of various social circumstances, and that's violent, and that's
Yeah,
why postmodernism, broadly construed, has been so critical of the Western tradition. Um, that's why Popper has an allergy against Plato and Hegel and the implications of idealist political philosophy, which he thinks is intrinsically authoritarian.
yeah. Well,
Um,
against the open society, yes, the open society and its enemies.
right. And so when we do metaphysics, like I don't disagree that we should have we should strive to be as disinterested as possible and to make it our ideal methodologically to overcome our own particularity, recognize our situatedness, but not be determined by it.
No,
And not imagine we could ever achieve a view from nowhere, but at the same
no.
time strive towards more impartiality,
Well, it's
right?
the just to interject for a second, it's actually the recognition of our ineliminable perspectivalism or like particularity that encourages the ethical move of not taking that which I already possess as ultimate, right? So it's recognizing this ineliminable situatedness contingency of what I believe, which makes me want to take a step back and say, hey, I'm in no position to prescribe a common good to all of my fellow creatures. I recognize the problem there, and as I've said to you many times, and whether we're going to get to this through this conversation, I don't know. But we find our values and our goods in our direct engagement with the world. You know, value is extremely real to me, but it's real because of a direct and present engagement. And of course, I'm not saying we can't widen the circle of care either. That's a specific goal that we're talking about here. But I am saying that we shouldn't find our ideals in abstract basically ideals. You know, we shouldn't confuse abstract notions of universality with, and this is Whitehead's ontological principle in a certain sense, right? The concrete particulars of our engagement are where we find value, and we do analogically extend it as part of the process of widening that circle of care, and that's incredibly important. However, when we shift the locus of value to a symbol or an abstract notion or ideal, I think that's where we have made the mistake, and that is the mistake that leads to nihilism. It's not that we need to recover our faith in abstract. I no, it's like to not be nihilistic, be where you are right now, because
Mm,
real things are happening.
yeah.
Um,
So
Animals are not non-human organisms are not nihilistic and not threatened by nihilistic because they're engaged in concrete realities all the time.
mm,
Anyway,
yeah, no, I think the non-human world of at least biological organisms, from the cellular single cell on up, all living organisms are engaged in normative evaluation. Would you agree with that? I mean,
yes, but just to plant a flag, and sorry to keep interrupting, this is not the same as saying that their world, like everything comes to them already evaluated.
no, no.
Right. Well, so when you read your, you know, Weber and Varela paper and Life After Kant and
Mhm.
their channeling of Hans Jonas and stuff, there, and sorry to listeners who haven't read this stuff, and it will be esoteric, and we're not going to unpack it in great
It's a very
detail.
important paper. If they haven't, they should have by now.
It's a very interesting paper, but I think there are reasons to be highly critical of the kind of thing they're saying, because they're saying that because of the structure of the operational closure of the organism, everything that organism encounters is coming to it pre-evaluated, and in fact, you can't encounter anything except through value for them. And I think that that's actually not right, because that excludes the possibility of bare particularity. That excludes the possibility of firstness. And if this
Yeah,
were the case, as you said when we were discussing it, there could be no evolution. There can be
exactly.
no. And so closing the horizon of meaning, of value, this is a very, very dodgy move. Um, and I know all the activists will want to come at me now. And oh, the closure's not really like that, and blah, blah, blah. Well, let's do a genealogy of closure. Let's talk about what closure really is. You know, where does that idea come from? And we're not going to do it right now. But I'm prepared to have that discussion.
Yeah. Well, I think that as so I would want to say that if we're going to channel Peirce, for example, we want our ideas to be clear, but we have to acknowledge that there is no fact value bifurcation. Any fact is already picked out because of a certain interest and that shapes our perspective. Um, and so there's a co-arising and a co-variation of our evaluations and our observations.
As a component, and you agree with this, but just to highlight, as a factor of our situatedness, of our
Mhm.
embodiedness, of all of that, yes.
Yeah,
That's
yeah.
not metaphysics, but it's true. That's just not metaphysics. It's true though.
Mm. Well, if metaphysics is not seeking a view from nowhere, then I don't think we're going to be able to avoid perspectival evaluations, normative judgments, in our, determination of what the relevant facts are that would constrain our metaphysical reflections. So I
Good.
think I don't know how ultimately we want to strive for disinterestedness and to not be determined by religious or political or other ideological dogmas, and how we reflect on the ultimate nature of reality, or the impossibility of arriving at an understanding of the ultimate nature of reality, if that's our metaphysical, uh, you know, the approach that we're taking, the non-foundationalist approach. We're Normative evaluation feels inescapable to me, right? And
So,
so you're talking about a regulative ideal to be disinterested, with which I agree, but
yeah.
metaphysically, I don't know that there is a reality to be reached or even approached that could be that could be value free. I think value is woven into factuality and facticity. It's just part of what there is.
Well, I firstly want to just signal also just the life without why for a second, right?
Mm.
So the stance that we can take towards things, which is as non-normative as is possible, and we can
Mhm.
maybe talk about that. And we should talk about that because we're going to talk about hopefully apophaticism
But what is
and
axial ontology? And we can approach, yeah. So I mean, go ahead.
let's
I
do
love that term from Simondon because it seems to
yeah,
really
great
be what
term.
I'm arguing for.
Yeah, no, for sure. It's a great term. There were a number of things that you said in sort of quick succession there about like the view from nowhere and ultimate nature of reality. And like let's maybe take it as we stipulated that in a sense metaphysics has rarely been practiced as it might be. This is fairly obvious. Um, and that often it's been practiced in terms of like a confusion of discourses or a confusion of levels, and the kind of the basic notion that characterizes conservatism would be the confusion of something contingent with something ultimate. So saying that this is not subject to modification because we've reached the bedrock here, we've got the ultimate set of values, we've got the ultimate whatever. So we will fight to the death to preserve them, right?
And that's
So
conservative because it's mistaking something historically constructed and normal historically for something eternal.
exactly. Yes, it's or something contingent for something ultimate, right? Saying the same
Yeah.
thing. Um, so when you say metaphysics is about the ultimate nature of reality, I'm just going to say no. I'm going to say that the different terminology that you and I have also agreed upon, which is that it's the most general conditions of reality or something like that. And so, of course, we can't have a view from nowhere. Like a view from nowhere is Laplace's demon, right? It's God. Like it's the God that's outside of the system. Just notice that all notions of closure are descended from this notion also of a um, of a boundary that, in principle, something could be outside of to take in the whole thing at once. There are lots of nuances in the development of different notions of closure. I'm not denying that, but closure and the existence of an outside point, fixed point from which that system can be viewed are very, very related notions. You've disappeared. Am I talking to a void?
I'm hearing
Um,
you. I'm listening. I'm trying to plug in a light because it's getting dark here. Sorry.
um, but so because we can have no view from nowhere, and because we're not talking about the ultimate nature of reality in that way that metaphysics is often characterized, which is part of this classical tradition that we're problematizing, because we're talking about more like the most generalized conditions of realization, actually, because this is a dynamic conception. Um, and we're talking, or the way I'm talking about metaphysics as a diagrammatic method. And the reason I have my minimization postulate is precisely because we cannot remove from what I call the prosaic, from our lived experience, from our direct encounter with the world, all of those particularities and the anthropomorphism and the evaluation and blah blah blah. But I mean, I say this and I know it's trite in a way, but it's like just to do a reductio ad absurdum, it is a very firm conviction of mine that I will go to war for probably that my daughter is the most important person in the world. But I don't expect that to be your conviction or anybody else's except my wife's probably. Um, you know. Um, so again, that's a reductio ad absurdum. But in metaphysics, we're not saying at all like we need a picture of the general conditions, most general conditions of realization that makes it possible that I would be in the position where I think my daughter is so valuable to me. But the fact of her value to me is not part of that picture of conditions. So when
But
we're
when we do metaphysics, we're still are one of the things we're trying to account for is the fact that you love your daughter. That's one of the things that an adequate metaphysics should say something about.
but
How
we're
is
not,
it?
I don't
Why
think
do
we're
we
trying.
love particulars to that degree that are
Yeah.
related to it? Like we need an account of that. If we're going to have an adequate metaphysics, it would give an account of the most valuable things in our lives, wouldn't it?
Well, I would say we need an account of that, but there are different discourses which will come into and metaphysics will be one of them. But metaphysics will not be the discourse which ultimately gives a so-called complete account of why I love my daughter.
Right. But in terms
Um,
of the social contract, we have our families and I mean, in the modern liberal context, we have our private lives and we have public life. But metaphysics, I would hope, would provide us with some way. I would want a metaphysics that I considered adequate to be able to provide me some bridge, some way of communicating meaningfully about why how it's possible for me to value my relationships to my family and the people that I love in my personal life, at the same time that I can value the public good and a sense of civic responsibility. Like, how do we connect those things? I think if we don't have a viable, adequate metaphysics, we lose that bridge, and that's part of the situation we find ourselves in, I think.
I actually completely agree, but we have to be precise. So, what we want from metaphysics. So I always use this example. I've used it to you so many times, and I used it earlier in a meeting today. So it's just something that I say all the time. So apologies for being so repetitive. But um, we want a metaphysics that is to life, the universe, and everything, something similar to say what, a Darwinian triad is to biology, right? So when people ask me, why does a baby brown snake? I mean, I
Which is variation, selection, inheritance is
yes,
the triad.
exactly.
Okay, just in case people were wondering.
Yeah, variation, selection, and inheritance. So or you could just say the principle of natural selection if you wanted, but I'm avoiding that because we all know that it has
Principles are problematic.
and it also has a particular set of limitations, right? And people will then want to argue, is sexual selection a form of natural selection, blah, 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 or there are other kinds of so we're going maximally abstract with this Darwin Purcell Wanton triad of variation, selection, and inheritance. It's a diagram. It's a for a very specific reason to avoid the loadedness of certain other terms. And so when people ask a question about something specific in biology, like why does this Chromodor, I'm going to use a different example, why does this Chromodorus nudibranch have the colors that it has? I don't say evolution. I don't say natural selection and imagine that I've explained anything. I have not given an account of why this nudibranch has the colors that it has when I evoke an incredibly general principle. However, that principle or that diagram um, is exactly what I am going to begin with when I start trying to construct, based on a, as exhaustive as possible survey of empirical details, an account of why of particulars of why that organism is the way that it is. I will, because variation is the first term of the triad, I will recognize the inevitability of an indivisible remainder. So I have no pretense to complete explanation, but to approach the completest possible explanation, I will use this basic methodological posit as a way of getting a foot on the rung, of getting going. Just as we were talking last week about, why do we speak of the pleroma at all? 2 weeks ago, whenever that was, Jung talking about that. We speak about it because we need somewhere to begin.
Mm.
Metaphysics is that kind of thing for me, right? Metaphysics is the kind of thing that allows us to begin giving an account and doesn't cut off that account at the knees. You don't have like a metaphysics that would make it impossible or absurd or whatever, with deference to, absurdism. Camus and friends, that would make it ridiculous in some way that I love my daughter so much is a non-starter. Because when you're starting from a position that makes the most real things to us have a sort of frisson of irreality or unreality to them, you've already made a mistake. Like, because again, you'd be then confusing this abstract schema, because metaphysics is indelibly abstract, incurably abstract, as most general. That's what it means. To say that something is that general, that it applies across all these particulars, not just in this actual concrete particular, it's necessarily abstract. If you were to have a metaphysics that made the bare concrete particulars of life impossible or ridiculous or unreal, you've already, and that's a huge part of the mistake that we have systematically made with metaphysics, right? Um, but metaphysics is not, in my opinion, and let's just call it the spec. If my little triad of discourses, or not discourses so much as domains of reality or stances towards reality, the prosaic, the inquired, and the speculative, I've got this minimalist notion of the speculative, which I'm saying is metaphysics. Like, this is the way I think we should do metaphysics. It's what would allow me to get started in providing an account of that. So it's again an image of the primordial in some sense. So if you were thinking about it all in terms of an evolutionary series, and this is really the generalization of transcendentalism that you're calling descendentalism, right? It's like, what are the minimal precondition? Okay, I'm adding minimal, but what are the preconditions? What are the conditions of possibility of down the track in some genetic, process, a world in which I love my daughter more than anything else exists as the most manifest bare particular reality. That's what metaphysics is to me. So you can call it an image of the primordial. In a different domain, you can call it a minimal posit. How do I get going in thought? How do I start to reason about things? How do I start to derive explanations of things? But it is not like a big picture of things with all different, colorful elements to it that are the particulars. Metaphysics doesn't contain any particularity, in my opinion.
No,
It's
no,
most
neither
general.
does science, actually. Science contains the species. I mean, there are all these special sciences that have their
Yeah.
various domains of inquiry, but
Yeah.
even, and science is statistical, right?
Yeah.
And so the
Well,
particular is left out not only of metaphysics, which is
yeah,
seeking the
yeah,
most general, and the special sciences, which try to give us these laws that are
yeah.
statistical. And then there's the particular, which is where our personal lives mostly occur. And so I think these levels are important, and I don't know if that exactly maps on to your,
Well, it
the
does.
prosaic and okay.
Yeah. Well, there would be nuance to talk in talking about science and its relation to the particular, just as there is actually with metaphysics. Because I mean, what I am eliding by saying that, we have this Darwin Peirce Lewontin triad in biology is, of course, my belief that something very similar to that is in fact what lives in the speculative domain in general, right? That's the premise for a kind of constructive realism or ontogenesis as first philosophy, or basically a process relational conception that we share. And the thing about it is that it begins with variation. So this minimal diagram in metaphysics can't explain, um, why there's this particularity in the world, the nudibranch or my daughter or whatever, because it takes the absolute inexplicable nature of particularity as such as its first. It's like we begin with particulars. And the thing, so science
Yep.
can't give you science for struggle very difficult, very much to give you that explanatory in the exact same way to give you the explanatory account of bare particularity. But again, this is what empiricism is. So to the extent that science is empirical, it departs from the particulars. This is Whitehead again, right? It departs from the particulars
Yeah.
towards the general. Um, so this
Yeah.
is
It
there's
strikes me.
slightly loopy, because in one sense you're like metaphysics is the most general, and it's what makes an incomplete account of particularity possible, but at the same time metaphysics first posit is the irreducibility of
Particularity. Yeah,
particularity.
yeah.
So we're
That's
starting.
why Whitehead says philosophy or metaphysics is the critic of the abstractions of the special sciences. Like that's a way
Yeah.
of preserving the modes of attention that would not allow us to forget the particular in our search for scientific uh, special laws, statistical laws. Um, at the level it's approaching generality, but metaphysics would be as far as we can take the process of generalization. And we want our metaphysics to be genetic also, which is to say it's, I love, and I go into this in chapter 3, the shift that Deleuze makes from the Kantian pursuit of the transcendental conditions of knowledge to instead transcendental conditions of learning, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
that
Yeah. Yeah.
we're able to continually generate new concepts and new categories instead of being locked into some fixed table,
Yeah.
which is Kant's problem. It's not only that Kant's categories, on the side of the understanding and reason are fixed, but his account of space and time, the domain of intuition or sensibility, is also fixed. He thinks
Yeah.
space and time, we can only have experiential knowledge of space and time through Euclidean geometry. And
Yeah.
in fact, I mean, if we think about contemporary cosmology, it's like we have now observations, measurements through technological extensions of our senses of the cosmic microwave background radiation. It's like the edge of space. And it's like the best representation, informationally speaking, of uh, randomness and arbitrariness. It's like but and there's some anomalies there. Maybe it's not perfectly random. There's some things that don't seem perfectly random about it, quantum fluctuations and all that. But outer space, outer intuition and Kant sense, right, opens out into this, in a sense, disorder, ultimate disorder. And then
Yeah.
I think also if you take Hume seriously, and Kant kind of hedges here, and he's like, sorry, Descartes, we can't be certain of our own existence as substantial selves, but we have to assume that there is a transcendental unity of apperception for science to make any sense because of the importance of the idea of unity as an idea of reason to ground scientific experimentation and the pursuit of laws in nature. I mean, Kant has all these brilliant moves to be like, showing how we can't fully let go of idealism, even if we want to be fully serious about science in its pursuit of universal and necessary laws. Um, but when we go inward for Kant, he can't agree with Descartes that we arrive at some unified self that we have a certain direct intellectual intuition of. Fichte would say you're wrong, Kant. We do have an intellectual intuition of that. Um, and then German idealism spins off from all of that. But I think what I'm one of the things I'm really trying to do in that chapter 3 is not run away from the nothingness that we encounter in our outer intuition of space, looking out at the emptiness that Pascal said terrifies him, the infinity
Yeah.
of the space is and the inward emptiness, the lack of it in our,
Mm.
as Buddhists are well aware of it, that there is no um, substantial self. And so outward and inward, we arrive at there's no foundation anywhere. And so how do we begin to recover metaphysics and philosophy in the context where there's a nothingness at both ends of this
Yeah.
of intuition, right?
Right.
And I think that's where the relationship between fact and value becomes so generative. So the fact of the matter is that there's a nothingness at both ends of our experience.
Mhm.
But the value comes into the picture because even after we've realized that, I mean, it brings us to the edge of our humanness, which Nietzsche, as a prime exemplar of the shamanic dismemberment that can occur when we're brought to that edge. He, whether it's we could blame disease, maybe uh, he had syphilis or whatever, or he just lost his mind for some psychological reason. I mean, not to make a mind-body
Yeah.
separation, but
Stared too long into the abyss. Yeah.
he stared too long to the abyss, and he wasn't able to overcome this encounter with nothingness. And
Mhm.
whether or not whatever overcome means, he saw that the human condition was a portal of some kind, and he did not make it through. And maybe none of us is going to make it through. And this is an individual confrontation with nothing, but it's also a political and a social confrontation with nothing. And I think that's the modern condition. And the post
Mhm.
or hyper modern, I think post-modernity is hyper modernity in many ways. That's the situation we're in. And so we can't run from the nothingness. We have to sit with that groundlessness and see what arises from it. And, you know, you talked about the Darwinian triad, or the Persian triad. Um, And the question for me at this point, in the encounter with nihilism is, uh, do what we can't escape our participation in this. So as inquirers, uh, there's a realization that how we respond to the situation is not incidentally related to the reality of of our situation. Like we have a participatory role to play in shaping what is true in this case when we confront the ultimate groundlessness,
Yeah,
right?
because it's a non-unitary theory of relational engagement.
Yeah.
You know,
And this is like James's will to believe, the same sort of dilemma he enters into about the pragmatist wager. Like, am I going to believe that I am determined and I have no freedom, or am I going to believe that I'm free? Well, the answer to that question might depend on how you answer the question. I mean, I don't mean to
oh,
be tautological about it, but that's the pragmatist wager at the level of ontology. There's a pragmatist epistemology that a lot of people are familiar with that seems like instrumentalism, but Peirce and James in some moments brings it to that ontological and even theological level.
so
Um,
the thing about nothingness, right? The generative nothing, as Peirce would actually say, of
yeah.
the absolute firstness at the very beginning of of his evolutionary realist scheme, right? Of course, anyone who's listened to a number of our talks, I will always have to say his omega I take real issue with, but he kind of gets the alpha right because you even sort of one of the things you were saying, there's nothing at the beginning, there's nothing at the end. Yeah, that's the situation with time as well, right? You know, the pre-individual future and the pre-individual past, and that is a function of situatedness, as we've discussed a number of times. You cannot see everywhere from here. And the further away you try to look, you're eventually going to hit that nothingness, right? You're going to hit a singularity, but in the very, formal or rigorous sense in which that is the edge of your effective theory. That is the edge, that is the boundary of the domain of applicability of a theory that you have. Okay, this is what physics is. Physics is a stack of effective theories, and a singularity where the curvature of space goes to infinity, where you have the ultraviolet catastrophe, whatever, that is the boundary of the domain of applicability of a specific effective theory. We as living systems are effective theorizers. Um, Intelligibility, framing, solving the frame problem, all of that is akin to effective theory. This is why the free energy principle emerges interestingly as an effective theory of effective theorization, as I like to say. But what you're encountering is the other, is the alterity, is the outside of that effective theory. And we know you can encounter it like right here, right now, just as you can encounter it by looking back as far as you can and finding the cosmic, microwave background. And then just taking that as your given, initial conditions and saying, well, with given those initial conditions and entailing, so the past hypothesis in cosmology and all of that, we'll take the past as this inexplicable given, and then we will explain everything in light of it. And of course, that's a very rational, pointedly rational approach to take. And physicalism is rationalism and blah, blah, blah. And I'm drawing too many different connections here for this to remain coherent. But one thing I will say, which is that this generative nothing or nothingness is in fact operationally isomorphic with bare particularity. So
Mm.
when you are meditating on firstness and when you are encountering everything as a bare particular, not where, not not where is it coming from, not where is it going, not why is it the way that it is, not how come, none of those questions, just right here, right now, it is, right? Um, that is like the nothing. That's the same thing as the nothing. Um, and how does value enter into the picture? It's really interesting because I would be coming across to your side of things in some sense by saying that, well, value is in fact identifiable above all with their particularity or with the nothing, because the nothing is the source, right? The nothing, and I don't like this term, the nothing, to be honest. I mean, it's very traditional, but I
The
like,
womb,
sorry.
the receptacle. I mean,
Yeah, sure, sure,
the
sure.
Cora.
Or variation as such, or difference as such, or
Yeah.
whatever, the pre-individual.
Let's pause at this pregnant moment. I have to use the restroom, and then we'll come back and continue on talking about the pregnant nothingness. 1 second. You have to pee too. Okay.
Well,
Okay, be right back. All right, let's me. Whoa, what's going on with my camera here? It's really zoomed in.
your camera's been doing all kinds of funny stuff, actually. It's been moving and zooming.
I, that's odd. Let me see.
There
There you
you
go.
go.
Okay.
There he is. Um, yeah, so look, if you encounter the pregnant nothingness, the bare particularity from within an effective theory that you have taken to be absolute, if you're a conservative essentialist and all meaning and all whatever possibility of intelligibility and all of that is understood in relation to this fixed point, and then you encounter something that is outside that, it's horrifying. It's the chthonic, it's Cthulhu, right? It's a horror, you know. It's That's what Bataille is talking about when he's talking about horror, the
Mhm.
horror of the other. But if you are coming from a totally different perspective, like the one we're coming from, in which that bare particularity, that alterity is the condition of there being any effective theory whatsoever, let's say, right, is the condition of there being any structure whatsoever, and the condition of that structure being able to vary in an ongoing manner. And we're actually valuing things like creativity and improvisation and heterogenesis and degrees of freedom, lines of flight, all of that kind of stuff. It's actually not horrifying. It's the basis of value. It's the thing when I say in my social contract talk that the only thing I can really say about a kind of common good is that don't block the ontogenetic process. I'm saying exactly that. Don't set yourself up in a domain where you think you've got the absolute truth.
Yeah.
You try to subjugate the other or bring the other inside. And this is like a key move, right? If you bring the other inside, you neutralize it. And that's comforting. That's comforting. A lot of hegemonic authoritarian forms of thought. I mean, this is going to sound funny, obviously, in terms of the way that fascism often, styles itself in relation to another, but it tries to subjugate and eliminate that other, obviously. But a more peaceful way that authoritarianism in thought works is to bring the other inside and neuter it. And
Assimilation. Yeah.
yeah, exactly. And this is actually, we should talk about some passages in your book because this is part of my concern about the mixing of the discourses in a way, right? Is that when you, well, I mean, I can speak to that in detail with some readings, but I'll let you respond first.
Yeah, well, I mean, there's the danger in interreligious dialogue, there's exclusivism and then there's inclusivism and then there's actual pluralism. Those are like
Yeah.
the three. And inclusivism is like people who say, well, the Krishna worshipers don't realize that they're actually worshiping Christ, so we can include them in our understanding of the ultimate nature of reality. And I think that's better than exclusivism, which is to say that, oh, those heathens are going straight to hell because they don't believe in the right God.
Mm.
But it's not the sort of radical pluralism that I would ultimately want to
Yeah.
affirm, where none of us can claim to have access to the ultimate nature of reality. Um, but I
Very
think,
condescending. It's very condescending, the inclusivist position. It's like, you know,
but it's also condescending for the secular humanist to say, oh, all you religious people have your made up beliefs, and you should start from the neutral ground that we have discovered, and then see what meaning you can make. I think that's condescending to the religious believers. So there is no neutral ground. There is no place to stand that isn't rooted in some sort of evaluative, a normative evaluation, about what is of importance in what's given. And I think the key, though, is what establishes the pluralism, ontological pluralism, that I would insist on as it's not only an ethical starting point, but it's an ontological starting point. It is ontological pluralism. Um,
Mhm.
it's that point again that metaphysics presupposes that something is given, and what is given is that we find ourselves in a buzzing world amid a democracy of fellow creatures, and none of us has a view from nowhere.
Yeah, what is given is bare particularity, in fact.
The
What is given,
democracy of fellow creatures. Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
exactly. They're not even fellow creatures or anything like that. That's already, you know, um, we
Bare
cannot,
particularity is not as that the
not, not as well.
bareness and particularity as concepts have a rich lineage of etymological and pragmatic use. And I mean, it's not any more neutral than democracy of fellow creatures, ultimately. I don't know, you know.
No, fair enough. Okay, fair enough. What I'm trying to describe by using those terms, and it's and intentionally jarring terms, like when I say sacred nominalism, people are
Hmm.
like, "What?" Um, but meditation on firstness, that's probably slightly better
Nominalism
because,
began as sacred. It was a defense of divine power. I mean,
of
ultimately, that's how it originated.
course, but a meditation on firstness, we can put it at, and again, not because there's no assimilation going on there at all. There are no creatures as such, right? There's no language. Um, there's just what,
Creativity. I don't know. You don't like that word either, but that's Whitehead's word for it.
I don't like it as a word for what's ultimate as such. It's just happening. It's
Firstness is the best we could do if we want. But then no one's like firstness. It's so abstract. It's like, okay.
but I
This
mean,
is-
it would be, I will say it's just ongoing. It's just
Yeah.
it's a happening. It's
Mhm.
happening, Like I would intentionally reach for a term that is not profound.
I think
Uh,
it was Ralph Pred who, in his interpretation of Whitehead, said, look, we should, instead of creativity, let's just say on flow.
Yeah, well, that's
Yeah.
not bad. That's actually not bad in a way, right? Um, it's just, but it's like it's just happening, like it's bare, or it's obviously not the actus purus in the classical theological sense, but it's pure act. It's just act. It's just the thing. It's like I say with when we talk about like spontaneous brain activity and stochastic gene expression and babbling. It is just babbling. It's moving because it is the nature of the thing to
It doesn't
move.
per se, it's the possible and the actual would, the act would be secondness for Peirce, right? I mean, he likes
Yeah,
to
but
say firstness is possibility.
that's true, but I think actually that just as the pre-individual is pre-vital and pre-physical and pre-mental and all of those things, it's pre the distinction between actual and virtual. Like it's the many one or whatever, It's like it's actual and virtual at the same time
Yeah.
because actual and virtual are not substantially distinct. They are
Mhm.
operationally distinct.
Mhm.
And thus it's quite possible everything is actual and virtual at the same time in some sense, And so
Yeah.
when you're meditating on firstness, you are looking at that thing in it kind of its
Yeah.
light, its
Sure.
virtual light,
This
right?
is this is Kusa's coincidence of opposites, where instead of Aquinas saying God is pure act, he says God is posse ipsum, God is pure possibility, and this means the same thing.
Yeah, yeah, that's exactly it. Yeah. Um, Obviously lots and lots of profound insight in classical theology that I very much make use of and I very much value, and I absolutely love a lot of, esoteric or contemplative Christian philosophers or Christian mystics or whatever. I think that there's a move that they make which I always want to problematize. And this is what I want to talk about with a passage in your book a little bit, right?
Mm.
Because it's the of course, when you say apophaticism, cataphaticism is its obvious, it's its corollary, right? But there's the bringing of the outside in, which is
Yeah.
done sometimes not necessarily formally, but it's done in language. It's about trying to speak about that which cannot be spoken about, right? So you're trying to speak about ineffability. And of course, it's also worth pointing out in this terms like meditation on firstness and blah 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 that everything is ineffable. Every experience is ineffable. Like when you have a wildly non-ordinary experience, you take a high dose of mushrooms or whatever, you just have a spot, you see the Grand Canyon, whatever it is that stimulates that in you. You listen to a bird song um, you know, that is just you tuning in to that ineffable or being pushed, stimulated to notice that ineffability. But ordinary experience is just as ineffable as everything else, right?
Sure. And language itself is open to that. And so, I both think language is limited, but also the mystics are wrong that we should give up trying to language
Yeah,
this process of onflow or whatever we want to call it, because language is not, contra Ferdinand de Saussure. It's not it's just signs pointing at other signs. No, there's a triadic relationship. Signs point at reality. And so there's always this openness to our
yeah,
languaging attempts that puts us into touch with something outside of language.
absolutely. Absolutely. And that's absolutely crucial for the sort of mystical literature, right?
Yeah.
Because, or just for religious literature in general, because that attempt to language the experience is what actually makes that experience more possible for other people. It's leading to the edge of the experience, but there is a point where the language stops. And that there will always be that point. There will always be an outside to language, which is just again, language, like any open evolving system, can do exactly what you were just saying, which is it can keep learning in its encounter with the outside and keep trying to figure it, but it will never subjugate it unless it becomes a dead structure. You know, once it's fully crystallized and we have the perfect dictionary, thank you, Whitehead, then, you know, it won't be open anymore. It'll be closed. Um, let me have a quick look at this passage. This, I mean, I've written so many notes on your thing, and obviously there's a bunch of stuff that I sent you in WhatsApp as well, which are related to a lot of these things. There's a lot of things we could talk about. Although as usual, we find a way to have a really fascinating conversation without needing to refer to all of like my ridiculous scratchings all over your book. And but you know, close reading is also part of what we're here to discuss, right? So starting on page 131, for Deleuze and Guattari, and we should talk a little bit about what I think is your, you know, always criticism offered in in the most loving way, straw manning of Deleuze. And I mean, yeah, you
Not the
can
first time I've been accused of that.
you can also you can reference Stenger's all you want, but
Mhm.
Stenger's is straw manning Deleuze. But and again, not that it's more about reducing all of Deleuze's thought to something in particular rather than saying these are aspects of Deleuze's thought, which is obviously true, right? But so starting at this bottom of page 131, for Deleuze and Guattari, the confrontation with chaos is the precondition of philosophy. I mean, we're talking about this, right? Um, Chaos provides the transcendental Abgrund or imaginal abyss from out of which emerge all a philosopher's concepts. In Schelling, chaos becomes the abyss of freedom, the dark precursor of thought, that which is absolutely mobile. I love that. Love that image, right? It's just a happening. It's not pre-constrained. It's absolutely mobile. So it's free in that sense, free movement, which is continually an other, exactly what we're talking about, continually and irreducibly other, like it is its nature that it is other, um, which cannot be held onto for a moment. For Schelling, then, this is now you, that was a Schelling quote, that last bit. For Schelling, then, the prime subject object of philosophical thought is not the autonomous self, as it was for Kant and Fichte, nor is it simply an objectified deterministic nature. Rather, in Schelling's natural philosophy, we are beckoned by the incomprehensible groundlessness preceding volitional selfhood and objectified physicality alike. This is so good, man. This I'm like fire. This groundless abyss is the invisible and unprethinkable productivity of nature. Still very consistent with what we're saying. Okay, now the turn comes. Schelling also refers to it as the divine imagination. Okay. Schelling was profoundly influenced both by Spinoza's identification of an infinite God with an infinite nature, as well as his distinction between natura naturata and natura naturans. I think what I just want to signal is that there's a subtle shift that's taking place across that passage. Now, it's not to say that like the abyss of freedom, dark precursor even, or absolutely mobile, or continually another, or blah blah blah. The Where was the other nice one? The unprethinkable productivity of nature. It's not to say that those are not like somewhat loaded terms. Obviously, you know, we're in this sort of poetic register the whole time here, but those are about they're mythopoetic or poetic terms that are used to attempt to figure something that is unassimilated to a broader framework. They're describing it specifically as the other to any given framework. But when you turn to divine imagination, and especially then when you say that this is the influence of Spinoza, we shift it into a different register. Now, because for Spinoza, God and nature are everything, right? Now there's no other. Now that divine imagination is inside the divine as the imagination of the divine, what you would call the divine relator, as opposed to being this unassimilable outside or other of all frames. So even if we had an frame, I mean, so Whitehead is kind of better here in a sense, right? Because creativity is the unassimilable outside to the frame, which is the primordial nature of God. But here
Yeah.
this was like a beautiful
I
passage.
mean, Schelling describes divine imagination as that's quite a unique way of rendering of doing theology and referring to theos, because usually it's
Yeah,
the divine intellect, the
sure.
divine mind. The divine imagination is Whitehead signaling. I mean, he's inheriting Jakob Böhme there in the sense that God is actually at odds with God's self,
Yeah,
and that there's a distinction in the Godhead between ground and existence. And imagination is a polar phenomenon. It's polarized. It's always in a tension, a state of, not even a state, a dynamic of tension. Um, and so to refer to divine imagination is quite a heterodox rendering of what God is. And it says it's a relator, as you're saying. To refer to the divine as a relator instead of a creator is to signal that God is not separate from the world. And that's to distinguish this view as a panentheism from Spinoza's pantheism, where um,
yeah.
it's not just that God is identical to the world in Spinoza's sense, but God is not separate from the world is a slightly subtler claim.
And I love all of that. And I think that we stand on the shoulders of these giant thinkers,
Mhm.
reaching slightly further, because even the God is at odds with itself. Um, th- I mean, I was suddenly thinking of Jung and like coordinate powers and blah blah blah. But there's
Well,
just
it's like you would prefer like the term like nature or matter, like these are still
yeah.
theologically
I'm not
these terms are drenched with a theological lineage, so we
yeah
can't avoid it. And so
yeah
to refer to a term like divine imagination after all those other descriptors, which are just as mythopoeic, but could be acceptable in a secular context, I think. Like even this, the idea of the secular is a theological construct. I mean, so we can't. I just feel like we can't escape these references and these theological inheritances, even while we want to not be naively possessed by them, such that we
yeah.
impose them unconsciously and wield abstract universals like weapons in an attempt to assimilate others to our dogmatic mode of thought. I mean, we want to certainly be on guard against that, but um, I think Schelling is already upsetting most of the theologians of his time and still
I
our
would
time by using a term like divine
I
imagination.
agree. I agree. I'm not saying it's not. I'm not saying he's completely bowing to the orthodoxy. I mean, Land's term when he's referring to Kant and Luther in terms of the revolt in service of the establishment or whatever he says does still spring to mind. It's of course heterodox. Like Eckhart is very heterodox. Um, the Godhead beyond God, but it is the Godhead. What I'm saying is the language is a very, and maybe that just avoids you being burnt at the stake or whatever as well. But the
Well,
language
if he had said it 200 years earlier, he might have suffered Bruno's fate, but he's a little bit later, so.
well, the language is still assimilative, and especially as I said, because you turn to the resonance with Spinoza immediately afterwards, you
Mhm.
are saying then that there is no real outside to that unity, which is the one, the whole, which is identifiable with God in this tradition. And I'm saying going a little bit further, like it would be more faithful in Eckhart, um, or Jakob Böhme or a lot of these people to the actual experiences that they had. And by the way, Jung is a very good writer on this. The original experience bore no resemblance to the dogma in which the terms of which forget the quote, but dogma is used to assimilate and to understand the experience, but the
Yeah.
experience itself always stands separate from that. And what I'm saying is there's a subtle move that's being made, I think there. It's just illustrative of this. There are lots of other
But you would agree though that to make the secular naturalist atheist position try to position that as neutral and not assimilative, or to say that it wouldn't be assimilative to say that's the neutral ground for metaphysics. The disinterested starting point would be to say, well, there is no God, or we shouldn't be engaging with theological language. I think that's just as assimilative in the opposite direction to say that that's the neutral ground that we begin from.
Well, I think that historically it very much has been. And just as you are keen to signal the heterodoxy of Schelling's position, I would say that my position is not that of all
Right.
of these.
But what is it then? I mean,
Well, my
if
position,
what's the discomfort with the divine imagination as opposed to what if I said nature's imagination or
uh,
natural imagination?
it would be slightly less loaded, but the point is that the issue is with having a fundamental entity. The issue is with having a unity at the base of things, as opposed to alterity as such at the base of things, and all unities having to emerge from that. And this is Whitehead's position, as you know better than I do. All unities. I mean, does he think of creativity as a unity? I mean,
No, it's one and many. He says
exactly.
explicitly.
Exactly, right. So it is a pyrrhon. Um,
Hmm.
and what's happening here in this history, like in the history of Christian mysticism, what typically happens is that a pyrrhon is assimilated to God. A pyrrhon is an aspect of God. So there's a recognition that there's this alterity that is, and the term infinite is often used here, right? And there are reasons to use that term, and there are reasons to be wary, I think, of certain usages of that term. Um, but a pyrrhon gets brought inside the fold. That is it. That is
Well, I
a
mean, the history of Christian philosophizing and theology is the struggle to come to agreeable terms on that question. I don't think there is, I mean, there's a Catholic position on it that stems from Aquinas and his inheritance of Aristotle. And there's a Gnostic, rendering of that that's very plural that we inherit from what we've recovered in the 20th century from some, texts that were dug out of the desert and that the Catholic Church tried to suppress. And then there's the whole Protestant and various iterations of Reformed theology. And so, what is the position, the Christian position on how the divine God, say, of the Old Testament or the um, Christ figure of the New Testament relates to this idea of infinitude, I think is a lot, very much a live question and always has been. Um, there are orthodoxies depending on which institution you're talking about. But if you take in the whole history, um, it's quite plural in terms of how this problem has been dealt with. And my way of inheriting that history is that, well, it's histories, first of all. There's a whole plurality of responses to the question. And I find it to be a very generative question. And
yeah.
I think theology is best done as a kind of poetry. So, like in Catherine Keller's sense, is a theopoetics where we're inheriting this plural tradition of struggling with this question and trying in real time in our own situation with the sciences that we have available to us, with the political sensitivities and the ethical sensitivities that we have available to us as modern people living in more or less pluralistic societies. We have to grapple with these questions in a fresh way. And it's helpful that we have these thinkers to inherit and to read and to help us. But they don't have there's no answers ready made to any of these questions.
I mean, full agreement and beautifully well said. Um, we can talk about, and we should talk about, like I said earlier, and I've said to you so many times, I'm not saying no theological discourse. I'm not saying no mythopoetics. I'm saying it has a very specific role to play. And we can talk about what that
Yeah.
is. But will you agree maybe that there is a shift between two ways of speaking about something ultimate, if we have to use that term, or something originary,
Mhm.
um, in that passage that I referenced there. That on the one hand you have just to put it in very basic terms. On the one hand you have a description of an absolute outside, and on the other hand you shift towards a discussion of something that is potentially assimilable, like is being moved
Well,
inside.
this is the paradox that all of the mystics and the great theologians in the Western tradition have always pointed to. As St. Augustine says, like God is that which is more intimate to me than I am to myself. But also God is that which is so transcendent that I can't possibly even begin to hope to imagine it, much less sense it or think it. And so there's this paradox and this tension between these two senses of the most intimate and the most transcendent. Um, and I
Absolutely.
don't,
Yeah, I love that. And it is relevant, but I mean, we can easily understand that Augustine quote in other terms that we're familiar with. Obviously, we can talk Jung and the
Mhm.
Paraclete, or we can talk Simondon and the pre-individual, and that the pre-individual is both the most generic and the most alter ulterior,
Mhm.
ulterior with an A, and is also the otherness within us, right? And we can get very empirical about that and talk about what activity there is in our bodies which is unpre-assimilated to the structure that we would generally think of as the organism. So the body without organs, right? So the body without organs is in some sense like the plane of consistency, that
Yeah.
everything is somehow on. And then it's also that aspect within the organism, which is always in some sense in those terms against the organism or whatever. It doesn't need to be against the organism. Organisms need this intrinsic variability in order to be able to respond to anything. So we can absolutely accept the profound insight that Augustine is making there and analogize it with these other things that we're always talking about. I'm trying to say something, um, yeah, I don't know. I'm trying to say something slightly different, I think. That I mean, maybe I need to think of a different way of saying it, which I don't have ready right now. But
Yeah.
I'm saying there is a tendency, and it's not absolute, it's a tendency with a choice of a certain set of terms, which go back certainly to Plato and probably and beyond, but if I say what I was going to say, you will rightly take exception. If I say they are the core of monotheism or something like that, but
Mm.
they are the mono of monotheism. Um, there is a certain set of terms which seem to me to make it more likely, even though we can create a bunch of buffers and nuance our views, and I would never deny the incredible richness of theological discourse, right? Um, but there are a certain set of terms which have a tendency towards being assimilative and being framing, end framing, you know. Um, and that's what I'm saying. Maybe we don't, I'm not saying we do without them, but I'm saying maybe we don't install them in our metaphysics, basically. Maybe
Mm.
we say, actually, yes, throughout most of the history of like, Western thought, metaphysics and theology have been essentially the same thing. Then there's a big revolt against that. And that leads many people to say the era of metaphysics is over and we can't do metaphysics. And I'm saying, no, that's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, so to speak. I'm saying we can actually do metaphysics, and indeed, a lot of our favorite philosophers are trying to do metaphysics in like a post-death of God sense, even if they're recuperating a relativized notion of God, like Whitehead is. Um, but I'm saying, we can do metaphysics and we can treat the diagrammatic approach as metaphysics as such. Um, and we can treat the mythopoetic approach as a way of mediating between lived experience and the diagrammatic
Yeah.
approach. Obviously, very abstract. But I'm saying then these are actually two separate discourses with two separate functions. They have two different operational roles, and that keeping them.
Sure. And that's very Platonist and Platinian, that distinction. It's this is the distinction between dialectic and myth, which is at play in every Platonic dialogue. And Plotinus, I think, thematizes that distinction, um, where, dialectic is the method for going from particularity back to the one, and no, sorry, myth is the way of going from particularity back to the one, and the dialectic is the procedure from the one back to the many and the particular. So
But
we
it's
need both, and they're distinct. And
okay.
I'm not trying to assimilate you to Platonism, but I guess, honestly, maybe I was there, but I'm mostly being facetious and
Yeah, yeah,
joking there.
yeah.
But I think I agree though. We want to we want to be clear when we're myth making, and we want to be clear when we're approaching what you would call after Simondon, a diagrammatic method. And I think that trying to be disinterested in our metaphysics, even if that metaphysics leads us to acknowledge that we're always situated, that we are always ensconced within the perspectives generated by our normative evaluations. Um, Even recognizing that is already a movement towards a more disinterested account of our
Yeah,
situation as
yeah,
knowers and as organisms. You know that
absolutely.
that we can't help but make those sorts of judgments. So we can be more careful about how we do metaphysics. And so I think that is an important distinction to make. And I'm not trying to collapse it, but I don't know that we can avoid the um, porousness of the two. And because I
Yeah.
wouldn't want to end up in a situation where we're pretending like I know the caricature of Platonism, where we're the philosopher kings and the elitists who can do pure metaphysics, but most of the hoi polloi are stuck in their myths and their stories, and they need narratives to make meaning of life. And so, uh,
No,
we
no, I
switch
mean,
into a different mode to talk to the mere people, but when we're philosophers, we're just going to do the abstract diagramming.
well,
That
I wrote you a little few messages about exactly this in our recent exchange to forestall that kind of criticism. So I said that, Simondon has this, slightly odd notion that everybody needs to become, to some degree, a technologist, right? And of course, technology for Simondon is the logos of techne, is the logos of technical objects, which entails understanding them in their aspect of genesis, technicity, right? The genesis of technical reality. And so he feels like in order not to be enslaved by technocrats, but also, in a sense, in a sort of indirect manner by our technical objects themselves, we need to have some degree of understanding of how they come to be. And of course, that involves this Kungiem-like relativization, where in fact the technical is always inside the vital, and all of these things, and often misunderstood, where people think, oh, Simondon means the technological spreads all over the world and is the primary discourse or something like that. That's not what he's talking about at all.
hmm,
Um, it's a very poor reading. Quite the opposite. And I'm just saying, it's the same thing with these images and the mythopoetic, and indeed the diagrammatic approach is not something that, like, maybe it's idealistic to say it like this, but maybe everybody needs to become literate with that kind of approach, which again, by kind of always putting the two things together, um, and the Platonic philosophers are still always nesting that distinction itself inside this metaphysical scheme, which I'm saying is already conflating those levels, right? Um, and I don't necessarily have it fully worked out exactly, because when I say the diagrammatic approach, I'm not really just talking about like maths, um, or like drawing pictures, like literal diagrams. I'm partly talking about things that are very akin to those ways of doing things. And so, in a sense, becoming literate with like diagrammatic metaphysics is like basic mathematical, literacy, basic numeracy, which is important for kids to acquire, right? But I'm talking about something that is within language as well, like within the discourse. It's a specific kind of discourse where we take as our ideal the description of operators in the most neutral terms that we can, or the most minimizing terms that we can give to them, whilst obviously recognizing that there are no absolutely neutral terms and there's no real neutral ground to stand on. And indeed, that I have normative reasons for advocating I feel like it's an ethical project, it's axiontological, at the same time, because of my concern about the way these other terms tend towards the assimilative and authoritarian. Not that they're exclusively that, but that they have that kind of impetus in them. And this is also, as you know, part of a study of the history of modern science and the way those terms get baked into, the way those operators, in fact, get
yeah,
baked into the way we do science. And that's the discussion of closure and all these things. This is not just a
yeah,
critique of, like, you know, Christian theology versus science or some nonsense like that. My critiques of physicalism are that it
Yeah.
is a formalization of
No,
exactly the same kind of operators
we're
that I'm critiquing.
we're
And
both against monotheism in its religious and theological context, as well as in its scientific context, where it becomes this pursuit of certain knowledge of the one truth, which
Yeah,
is
and hidden. And so the kinds of atheism that you were saying earlier, that we can't imagine that that's neutral and all of that. Those atheisms, just like the anti-humanism, can sometimes just be the shadow side of um of humanism, but take on a lot of the same operators, basically. That kind of atheism, that virulent new atheism, is not just religious in the sense that those people are so vehement and dogmatic. It's not just religious in the like pejorative sense. It's
yeah,
literally taking the structure and operations of its thought, like when it says, in fact, the universe is just a deterministic automaton or whatever. It's like, gee, that's just a theological idea. I mean, that's the rampant maximization of monotheism. In the absence of a caring deity. Um,
this is I was going to send this to you. Oh, it's reversed. It's Brian Cox, the physicist, who says it's a quote from one of his recent presentations. We humans represent an isolated island of meaning in a meaningless universe.
Yeah, I've heard that quote before. Yeah, yeah.
Um,
I mean,
very,
and
it's, but that's presented as the neutral scientific point of view when it's clearly not.
and it's especially egregious to say we humans as opposed to life, you know. And then
Mhm.
if you start to say life, then I start to go, well,
Sure.
you're
Right.
starting to make sense to me, right? But this ridiculous anthropocentrism, um,
Yeah.
which is so incredibly classically teleological and all of those things. It's a great chain of being idea that is. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, so I wanted to share, I meant to introduce our whole conversation in relationship to this Peter Sloterdijk
Oh
uh,
yeah.
excerpt that I thought helped frame how I see your talk on the common good and the social contract and everything, and the way in which not only are you rightly, keen to avoid any sorts of theological dogma, there's also this a, captured by political ideology that we want to avoid. And so any sort of easy reading off of a metaphysics or a cosmology into a political program is a quite a dangerous thing that we would want to
Yeah.
avoid. And I read this. It's from something Sloterdijk said at the Vitra Design Museum all the way back in 2011. But it really speaks to the relevance I think that metaphysics has to the spiritual renewal of our collective life that wouldn't necessarily be about a particular political program or even a particular religious belief system. But let me read what he says, and then I'll try to explain why I thought this was relevant. So he says, the epical theme beginning around 1900 is life reform, Lebensreform. That is the epical alternative to the concept that has structured the awareness of the change or changeability of the world since the French Revolution. It is the non-political concept of change, this idea of life reform. It was made classic around this time, 1900, by a constellation of minds that includes Friedrich Nietzsche, Rudolf Steiner, and a number of others. Um, in a large-scale synchronous analysis, Sloterdijk adds, even Wittgenstein could be included in this field of life reformers because he also belongs to this Austrian form of commitment to life reform, which includes an almost global uh, uh, reformatio mundi, or reformation of the world, the overcoming of the Austrian late Baroque period, the overcoming of sloppiness, overcoming inaccuracy, the need to understand that in between one well-built sentence and a cleanly drawn doorknob, so to speak, the same ethical pressure exists, and that the same formal asceticism must be maintained in one area as in the other. I think that reference to the drawing of a doorknob is people who don't know Wittgenstein very well might not know he was an architect and he drew up designs and everything. So he had there's a drawing I've seen of a doorknob that he made that I think it's what Sloterdijk's referring to there. And so these are considerations, Sloterdijk continues, that are characteristic of these tendencies that lead to the Vienna Circle and teleological positivism. But the evidence that you have to change your life from the ground up, that there's no point in practicing a few political phrases and founding a new party in the back room of a bar, but that what matters is that from the molecular point of view, so to speak, rebuilding entire lives is what gives the term life reform such epical tension. And the 20th century essentially ended with the realization that the revolutionaries were wrong and that the life reformers were right. And today we are at exactly this point again. So what I hear him saying there is that this idea of, okay, God is dead, religious dogma is the opiate of the masses, even though that Marx quote is more complicated because it's also the heart of a heartless world. But, after the death of God in the 20th century, political ideology replaces religion as the source for uh, redemption and this Marxist dialectical readings of history are another form of providential history. It's the secular transposition of the old theological understanding of that. Um, and what Sloterdijk is saying here is that in the 19th century, inheriting Nietzsche, which is I see Steiner's project as continuous with what Nietzsche was trying to do. Um, the life reform movement is more like what Jung was saying in terms of the real challenge of the 20th century and what's the risk is that at that intersection where human beings refuse to individuate and become captured by mass movements and political ideologies and think that we can impose some new structure, whether scientific or religious, onto society and solve everybody's problems as a result of that more scientific understanding,
Right.
rather than looking within, owning our own shadows and individuating in a way that would involve a form of ontogenesis, let's say, that's as intimate as any other experience could be. And no one else can tell us how to do this right. There's no universal prescription. There's no religious dogma that can tell you how to individuate. Each of us has to do that on our own. And so I think that metaphysics taps into the spiritual right here, not as a source of new political programs or religious dogmas, but as a mode of individuation, as a way of engaging in that great work that's also, uh, in a sense, the work that each of us as particular beings has to undertake for ourselves without, I mean, we can draw upon the resources of our culture. I mean, we do draw upon the resources of our cultural inheritance and our networks of association, but ultimately, if we successfully engage with that process of individuation, which isn't something we finish, but if we're able to continue along that path towards individuation, as Jung described it, um, it's because we're not expecting a universal solution, but nor are we just accepting the nihilistic uh, condition of meaninglessness that Nietzsche seemed to get hung up at, right? There's a
For
path.
the reasons we've already discussed,
Yeah,
because that nihilism is not at all a world devoid of value. It's a world devoid of a very specific value, which you measured all other values by, and
yep.
its anguish and its despair is a product of a hypervalue, a hypervaluation of
Yeah.
something.
Yeah. And so like Sloterdijk's often accused of being overly conservative. And I think there's a point that Jordan Peterson tries to make that he's terrible at making, which is like clean your room while his room behind him is such a fucking mess. It's such a funny meme. But Sloterdijk, I think, is criticized of being conservative in the sense that he's saying to individuals, not in an atomized sense. I mean, I think Sloterdijk would accept that we're all individuals are nexuses of relations, but uh, you must change your life, he would say, and that there's no political solution to the problems facing our species. It's like we all need to take responsibility for ourselves on some level. There it is. Yeah. Um, and so that I just, I read that quote earlier today and I was like, okay, that's where I see metaphysics intersecting uh, with normative evaluation at the level of individuation, not at the level of here's a political program and I'm going
Yeah.
to force you all to conform to what I think is universally true. It's more so that metaphysics is a pursuit where we're striving for a type of shared intelligibility that at the same time is affirming our participation in a radically perspectival and participatory world process, whereby we're not seeking representational knowledge, right? Where we would have a uh, that we could actually achieve a disinterested view from nowhere in the way that Descartes thought he could, and that the way that representational knowledge is understood, like we could, even if it's asymptotic and we're just about, knowledge is as you said earlier, which I wanted to bring up to nuance the language to bring it more into a line with what I think you meant, rather than saying with all the information that we have, I would say with all that we have been informed by, because information changes us. We're not a knower that then accumulates information. Every every time that we when information is perceived by us, uh, streaming in from the world around us, there's no neutral knower that's receiving that and uh, judging it from a position of representational purity or something. The knower is itself transformed by the receiving of that information. The knower is informed and not the same knower that they were before that information arrived.
In hyphen formed, right, or transformed. And so, Simondone's account, because it's a direct critique of information theory in exactly these terms, is really, really nice here, right? And so I've, generalized that as individuation as elicitation, right?
Mhm.
Which we talked about when we were talking about Levin and Deacon a while back, but also it was in my Life as Technical talk. And what information theory per se leaves out is the so-called imprinting of the signal form. It takes for granted that it leaves out, as Rouillet would say, the genesis of information, right? So on
Yeah.
either end of the transmission of information, which information theory, like the Shannon and Weaver theory, is an engineering theory of the transmission of information. The genesis of information is completely bracketed.
Yeah.
Uh, there are already two meaning makers, organisms, on either end. I just
Mhm.
say because I mean I like the Sloterdijk stuff and I think it's very relevant. Anthropotechnics, right? That's Sloterdijk notion that corresponds to life reform, right? About the view from nowhere, because you brought that up a few times. I mean, I guess what we'd be saying is that the view from nowhere is a view of nothing. Like the
Yeah.
view from nowhere is contentless, because you know any view of any particular thing is a relational engagement with that kind of thing, and
And
relations
the
are.
closest we get to a view from nowhere is affirming pure variation as right.
Now you've got it. That's the point. That's why metaphysics starts there, for me. That's why
Sure.
metaphysics then tries to, I mean, metaphysics is just such a loaded term, right? Like all these terms. But if we're talking about the function of the speculative in my little triad, speculative, inquired, and prosaic, the speculative is just this very minimal little thing which starts with variation and then in principle with selection and inheritance or similar. It's like firstness, secondness, and thirdness, right? um that in principle are required there. Then, of course, there's this incredible amount of constructive work to do to say what the world is actually like, as we encounter it in the prosaic, and in the inquired. And most of that work is, in fact, in the prosaic and the inquired, but it's always in dialogue with that little, minimal scheme, which is the speculative per se. It's like this is again, it's the most generic conditions of realization or genesis, and then all the real stuff is in those other is in the well we access all the real stuff through those other stances, like indirect lived experience or using all of the various strictures and rigor of inquired of science and mathematics and logic and blah blah blah, right? So that's what I'm saying, and I think it's a distinct conception of what metaphysics is. And again, it's not for me to pronounce upon the way everybody should do these things. That's kind of the opposite of what I'm saying. I'm saying I can't pronounce on these, but I will individuate in my way. And I'm just giving my justification to some degree for why I think the mythopoetic is not properly speculative in this. And again, maybe speculative is not the right term, right? Because that's also been used in different ways, and but
Yeah.
it's why I think the way that Whitehead mixes the diagrammatic and the theological and tries to make his God operator, his metaphysician's God is an operator named God. I'm like,
Hmm.
yeah, I just don't think so. Like, I don't think that's the right name to give that operator because it's just far too loaded. So if you're going to do that speculative thing, it's again not about an idealized view from nowhere. It's not the viewer from outside. It's recognizing that because we're incredibly situated, that because these terms are inevitably meaningful to us, that because all that anthropomorphic imagery is inevitably very intense for us, because we are, anthropomorphic, because we are anthropos ourselves, and because so much of the intensity of our lives comes from relations with other humans. Probably what drove us to be as intelligent as we are and everything is relations, including competitive relations with other humans, blah, blah, blah. Those images are always going to be loaded for us. And the whole idea when you're trying to speak or figure the most general thing, it's got to be the least loaded because the loading throws you back into your own particularity, and it drives you in a certain way. And if you don't have that, see, it's like we're fond of caricaturing the view from nowhere, and we should, right? But if you don't have that maximally abstract way of
Yeah.
engaging, then you are always caught up in the animation of the intensity of these images. And
Yeah.
obviously no one, goes out to march for a weird little abstract diagram. Maybe they do. It's like sigil magic or some
It's
stuff. You know, but for the most part, no. And I just want to also point out on that point that we are not in a meaning crisis because we're devoid of meaning. There's no sense in which we lack meaning in the world today. There's no sense in which we lack value and we're like, oh, I need value, I need value, I'm out of value. No, people are not fighting and marching in the street, and that we haven't gone into all this polarization and all of that because we lack meaning. The opposite. We are saturated by meaning, and we need an opportunity to be like, it's like the view from above or something, right? Like it's a meditation practice to some extent as well. And again, this metaphysical approach is very, very grounded in my own, prosaic practices, meditation, improvisation, all of these sorts of things. What does it take to stand back from your own thoughts? You know, it's not
Yep.
about introversion and extroversion. It's about treating the interior as if exterior as well, right? Like being empirical about what's going on inside you. And I mean, I guess that is soteriological in a certain sense. It's not a positive soteriological program, but it is a practice that generates both insight, but also, equanimity of a
Yeah,
certain.
I mean, Simondon says we must all become technologists, and Whitehead, in response to Plato's, Republic, says, well, in the modern period, because we've all become democratic, and that's the everyone in polite, well, the common sense of our time among modern societies is that democracy is the best form of government, and so Whitehead says, look, at this time in history, we must all become philosophers.
Yeah,
uh, you know, and so the instilling this philosophical attitude and this capacity to bracket, uh,
yeah,
and to observe not only the outside, but to observe ourselves in the process of thinking and the process of evaluating and judging is essential. And
yeah.
that's what philosophical education has always been about. You know,
Yeah, yeah, but of course at some ideal level, but also always subject to that co-option and appropriation, and that's why we're building brackets against that, and why we brackets, boundaries, closure. We're building fire breaks so that that is less likely to happen, and also and so that we don't become, Sherman's image of the philosopher as the civil servant who is really just there to shore up the status quo, right? But also, it's not. like philosophizing with a hammer or something in some naive sense. It's not destruction for destruction's sake. Like when you're in the political, when you're in the theological, when you're in the inquire various modes of inquiry and all of those sorts of things, when you're in the prosaic, it's not about breaking shit, you know. It's not about breaking everything down. There you have a lot of judgments that you're making all the time in your life. What's valuable to me? What do I want to preserve? What do I want to, we're all in the life is judgment, like I've said, it's not about absolutely suspending judgment. It's why again a lot of contemplative philosophies they're great for the practices and the orientation and the stance that they're about inculcating, but you do have to, unless you go and live in a monastery, but even then, you insert yourself back into the world at the same time. You step back, maybe you go and live in the cave for a while, up in the mountains or whatever, um, but and you contemplate interior and exterior as if they are one. This is also just, I have to say this again because of some comments made on the last video. The introversion extroversion distinction only goes so far. In fact, here the empirical versus rational distinction is actually more generic, because the empirical is the orientation towards the thing as if it's a bare particular or as if ulterior. Rational then would be subjugating that thing back into the shared scheme. That's why perennialism, for all its vagueness, is in fact a form of rationalism, not a properly empirical way of thinking. Anyway, where am I going? I'm saying yes, suspension and all of that is really important, but you're never going to escape the responsibility of judging from your own specific position as as a particularity yourself. You're not going to escape from that burden of individuation, as you put it there, nicely channeling Jung. But there's also a reason why Jung, his ethics are the ethics of particularity in a certain sense, right? Like read him on politics or read him on psychotherapy. It's the same thing. It's, in politics, the individual has its own responsibility that you were articulating. In psychotherapy, it's like, don't project, even though there's also a recognition of the inevitability that there's transference and countertransference and all of that, and that's part of the dynamic. But try not to pre-subjugate what's coming at you from the patient, from the analyst. Try not to immediately assimilate it to some predefined framework that you already have. That's why he's an empiricist. And that's why here psychic reality then becomes a very, very important. So this is another thing. If people could only understand, and in not, we're always not being elitist, right? It's like it would be really useful to, like, psychic reality is a really useful posit, because we're not saying that it's all in your head in some dismissive way. We're saying it's like profoundly real, but not necessarily real in the same sense as this glass is. There are different kinds of reality at play here. It's important for a theory of imagination, I should think, to make those kinds of distinctions.
Hmm.
And
Yeah,
if
yeah. I mean, my Schelling's divine imagination is,
yeah,
in Jung's psychological terms, the collective unconscious, the domain of the
or is it,
archetypes.
or is it though? How would you then relate the practice of active imagination um, with the divine, with the collective unconscious? Because there are just two different options here. One is to say that by engaging in a practice of active imagination or incubation or whatever, you're tapping into something that has a priori existence, but that is normally, walled off from
Divine
you.
imagination is specifically, it's not divine intellect, which would be a priori structure that you're tapping into. Divine imagination is something you're always participating in, changes you, and you change it in turn, right? So, yeah,
Exactly. So not a reificatory understanding of the archetypes in the collective unconscious. I just wanted to clarify that
right.
really at its barest again, that term, but at its, I don't know, all these terms are awful. I don't want to say fundamental or blah, 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 at its most fundamental or its ultimate nature or whatever, but it is just that happening itself. It's just that movement itself. It's like, to me, and maybe this is unfair, but Schelling, say, with his repudiation of the autonomous self as the ground of psyche, let's say, or whatever, is a better meditator than Fichte, let's say, right? He's got a deeper contemplative. He's more introspective in a certain sense, because the limit of introspection, just like the limit of extrospection, is just movement, just happening, just some process which is just creating, and recombining and blah blah blah. And you peel away the garb, to now channel person diagrammatism, and get to the point where it's just movement. The nature's just movement, and there's no content. And this is the closest you're going to get to the view from nowhere, because there's no content. There's just happening. And it's not something happening, it's just happening.
Mhm. Right. So we should probably move towards wrapping up here. I don't know if I have a sense for how to put a bow on any of this, other than to say that I found this to be uh, profoundly fruitful, and actually I feel more convergence with you after talking about this. You reading my chapter 3 and talking through it. I feel more convergence than before. Um, I don't know if you agree, or I'm just feeling that way because I have successfully assimilated you to my own way of thinking. Um,
Can I
yeah,
comment on that
please.
really quick? I send you a lot of, WhatsApp messages, and you respond, and you often say, I think we're in agreement here. And I think, we usually are about many, many things. And then there are lots of little things. So if we had done, which would have been exhausting for me and you and the readers or the listeners, like a minute textual analysis of which I've done. I mean, that's how I read. Then we would find more generative points of tension or disagreement,
Mhm.
right? Because I would be doing that. You would say that I've misunderstood, or that I'm absolutizing, or whatever, and that would be fine, because that would be where we would find that friction.
Mhm.
Just little bits where I'm like, well, did you need to use that language? What are the connotations of that language? How could we have kept this more separate, or more precise? Or, yeah, I really love that bit, but I'm kind of uneasy about that bit. And I mean, I read the epilogue as well. And there is this whole question of the straw manning of Deleuze, which we haven't discussed, which we don't need to discuss particularly.
Right.
But you've used Deleuze as a very fruitful, I mean, like you use me, kidding. Um, but as a very fruitful interlocutor, where you find a lot of value, right? But you are also using Whitehead to critique him. I mean, I
I
would say, one thing I would say is, I mean, two things I'll say really quick, is that it's not right to say that Deleuze is not systematic, and that his inheritance is mostly from, because you said that his greatest influences are Bergson and Nietzsche. Very questionable to say anyone is Deleuze. I mean, he has a lot
and
of
I
influence.
didn't know Simondon was a giant lacuna in my knowledge when I wrote
I mean,
this,
what about
which
what
I wrote
about
this 10 years ago, by the way. But
but what about his first, two books are on Hume? What about his book on Kant? What about the incredible influence of Kant? And what about Marcel Proust? I mean, he has a lot of influences, but
yeah,
the thing that the more important point is that what he actually does is, even when he's inheriting from those apparently non-systematic philosophers, is that he shows how they're systematic. So system is his prime concern in some sense, right? And that's kind of the way he talks about Hume, in the sense, like, every philosophy is the exploration of a specific problem to the nth degree. Like, what systematic exploration of the consequences of a particular problematic. That's how he understands all of those philosophers, I think. And the other thing is, what is the other thing? Oh, yeah. You said that Whitehead might accuse Deleuze or critique Deleuze in terms of his neglect of method. It was in the same place. And I would actually say that Deleuze is precisely an example of treating method as more important than system, in a certain sense. Even though I just said he's like systematic, but
yeah.
instead of trying to create the system, it's just about continually applying the method. So he is in some sense the most methodological. Um,
I
and this
think,
is,
I mean, I think that's fair, that I'm strawmanning Deleuze, but my main concern, and this was drawing on his friend Isabel Stenger's criticism of him, is less about whether the extent to which he's systematic, um, or that he has a articulated method. Because I mean, I draw on his pedagogical method in the earlier section of um, and in chapter three, even in the epilogue, even though in the epilogue I criticize him. So I'm more concerned though that he's and maybe this is a caricature still that he's enamored with deterritorialization and that Whitehead is more balanced in terms of uh, the inevitability of reterritorialization. And I know that Deleuze has that dialectic, or maybe that's the wrong word because he's critical of dialectics, but he wants to acknowledge deterritorialization and reterritorialization. I recognize that, but I feel like he's in Stenger's sense, he's so quick to want to skinny dip in the rivers of hell and just, valorize chaos, chaos mogenesis, that there's not enough attention paid to the need to speak to the social fabric that depends on common sense, that depends on we do need habits and mores, and we need to be in touch with the inherited religious terminology that structures the collective unconscious for the vast majority of people, and to
For all of us,
just
all of us, I would say for all of us, I'll go even further.
mm,
For
mhm,
sure, I think that we are, you and I mean, Westerners, whatever, gross universal term we're going to use, or, aggregative term we're going to use. Yeah, we are also like Christian or thinking in the biblical tradition. I mean, I went to an Anglican school. I went to
mm,
chapel every week. I read the Bible all through school. I'm not denying that that had an influence on the way that I see the world.
yeah.
Um,
So like when Deleuze is like, God is a lobster, which is interesting, and to explore what the hell, and his but and I find his way of writing and with Felix Guattari as well to be super generative, but it's
yeah.
also it's extremely elitist. And inaccessible for the vast majority of people, and so is Whitehead, of course.
Yeah, I was
But
going to say, that's a
but
reality.
but when Whitehead gets to part five and he
Yeah.
starts translating this into theological terms, all of a sudden it's accessible to way more people, and they say, "Oh, that's the
Chris,
pro oh to Christians at least."
yeah. But I mean, well, let's not get into that. I don't disagree with what you're saying. I want to read though the specific quote from your text, and then I want to contrast it with a quote from Deleuze and Guattari. And by the way, you keep talking about Deleuze in your book, which is very typical that Guattari. In that if we look at the footnote, it's Deleuze and Guattari. I mean, of course, you've got Difference and Repetition and other books too, but a lot of what is philosophy.
Yeah,
Um,
for sure. In the epilogue, I'm not giving Guattari enough cred. It's true.
Poor little Felix. He always gets ignored. So I'm going to read a quote from your book, and then I'm just going to read a quote from Deleuze and Guattari. And I'm going to note, by the way, that Nick Land has this great essay in Fanged Noumena. Great. I disagree with a lot of it, but it's a great essay on like tarrying with death or making it with death. It's called Making It with Death. Um, and it talks about Deleuze's and he kind of hints that Guattari is part of a betrayal of this, but Deleuze's betrayal, particularly in A Thousand Plateaus, of the absolute deterritorialization ideal, right? So it's quite interesting that Deleuze is so often caricatured, dare I say it, as being, so obsessed with deterritorialization, blah, 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 when there is a whole heap of people who think that he's not strong enough on that point.
Mm.
This is like what Jung would say. It's like if you're upsetting both sides, you're probably doing something right. But let me do this. Let me do this comparison of quotes. This is from your book. Isabel Stengers also criticizes Deleuze's tendency to celebrate the adventures of solitary heroic creators who fearlessly dive into chaos, while at the same time downplaying the conditions of creativity provided by their habitat and their inevitable need for social recuperation upon returning to consensual reality. So I looked up the Stengers passage in Thinking with Whitehead, and to her credit, she does say that Deleuze sometimes has that emphasis. But here's a quote. So just a reminder, inevitable need for social recuperation, return. Okay, here is Deleuze and Guattari. A technical element remains abstract, entirely undetermined, as long as one does not relate it to an assemblage it presupposes. It is the machine that is primary in relation to the technical element, not the technical machine, itself a collection of elements, but the social or collective machine, the machinic assemblage that determines what is a technical element at a given moment, what is its usage, extension, comprehension, etc. Okay, people might get thrown by the discussion of technical elements and things like that, right? Okay, there's a sort of Simondonian aspect here, and so it would be then important to understand the relationship between concretization in Simondon's account of the genesis of technical objects and the passage of objectification in the genesis of the image, right? So this is a process of individuation which is happening both in technical objects and also in psychic objects, right? This is analogical. But Deleuze and Guattari are here literally saying that a thing, like an isolated element that can potentially do stuff, that can exert technique, has no meaning, no comprehension, no extension, no usage. It is completely determined. Completely determined is the wrong way of putting it, actually, but it is determined at a given moment by its assemblage. So to say what you've quoted Stengers as saying is kind of like saying Deleuze doesn't think about assemblages, or as they call agencement, right? Agencyings is would be a maybe a better translation than assemblage, but agencyings is the togetherness that gives things their meaning, their capacity to act in a particular
Yeah.
way, all of that kind of stuff. So
Yeah.
Deleuze is a preeminent thinker of
Yeah.
relational.
But it also, I grant that. And I also in I think Anti-Oedipus, maybe he said maybe it's A Thousand Plateaus, I forget which, but he and Guattari say that, you could just dip into this, take any chapter you want, it might prove useful for the assemblage that
That's
you're
that.
part of. Yeah, so like you don't have to read this all the way through. We're not trying to make an argument that you need to, take on board. It's whatever pragmatic use this has for you and your worldly projects, like take it and run with it. And so, um, he's trying to make what he's doing as applicable to other people's struggles as possible. And in that sense, he's clearly not just trying to do some heroic individual exploration of ideas that wouldn't be accessible to anybody else. But he also would say, in What is Philosophy, he and Guattari talk about how much they hate conversation, how much they hate the idea of art as communicating anything, and so they're really trying to break down this idea of common sense and logic of sense. He talks about parasense, and he's really trying to disturb our usual habits of meaning making, which is really important, but
Yeah,
also can be overemphasized. And maybe I've encountered some Deleuzians that
yeah.
might fetishize that tendency, and maybe Deleuze is not as um, guilty of that as some imitators.
I
Uh,
just think that his thought and their thought together and apart with Guattari, it's just not summarizable. And so, yes, they have and they can be very excessive in those
which I
ways.
love, but
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah, and as you said, those are important. Like perturbing common sense is really important. Um,
But so is returning to it and making some gesture towards reconstructing it.
but again, that's what's being articulated in a lot of parts of A Thousand Plateaus. The
Yeah.
whole geology of morals chapter is about the necessity of stratification, the inevitability and the necessity of stratification, right?
Mhm.
So I don't think it's not. We have this problem again when we say like so and so thinks X, and especially with these thinkers, which are again, despite what I said about the way Deleuze treats other philosophers, are not necessarily preeminently concerned with like systematizing and making their entire thought coherent. Deleuze would just say, "Yeah, of course, I hate conversation, but I love conversation." Like it's not an issue that there's that kind of contradiction at that level of the thought for someone like him, I think. And you can totally understand the sentiment that he is, and it is kind of elitist in a way, but the sentiment, it's not elitist in terms of a stratification of society. It's basically saying like when he talks about how when someone wants to argue with him, he's just like, oh my God, no, I have no interest. I have no interest in debate whatsoever. It's because his thought is so overflowing all the time
Yeah.
that um, you know, there's inevitability of people picking up on some little thing and trying to take him to task for that. And he's just like, yeah, well, you just don't, like my thought is much more than that. And to get you to the point where you would understand my worldview would be like I already wrote like 20 books, would be and gave all these seminars and blah 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 would be so much effort. Like I don't even know where to begin. And sometimes it's like talking to people about evolution or something like that. And one always wants to rise to this challenge and try to say, and like I consider interpretation, that's a high ideal for me. Like I want to people to share my passion for organisms. And I've always wanted that when I was working in the zoo industry and all of that, and to take, like, not to dumb it down, because part of what's so amazing about things is how rich and complex they are, but to take that in and make it communicable and all of that. But sometimes your shoulders slump, right? You're like, oh, you have to explain this again, or it's like I don't even know where to begin to it's like, how am I gonna, explain in 2 minutes the difference between constructivism, social constructivism, and constructive realism or something like that. It's like um it's really difficult, and you can totally understand someone who would be so hounded by, and I mean you're a very popular guy and a lot of people want to talk to you, so you have some experience of that. But someone like a Deleuze, so hounded by people who want to talk to them or criticize them, it gets exhausting, right? And that's kind of what they're talking. It's like we can't expect to, you know um to communicate at some level some of the time.
Yeah. Well, all of your attempts to save Deleuze from any caricatures of mine are well taken, and I did treat him as a bit of a conceptual persona for my own
Yeah,
purposes,
yeah.
you know.
Also said, just to give one last nail in this coffin, you also implied at some point, I don't have the quote to hand, that Whitehead was concerned with, like, essentially a political project, whereas Deleuze was less so. And I'm like, I don't think you can say that, Deleuze was like extremely politically
Did I
engaged or
imply that? I mean, I maybe uh,
behind the. I'd
something
have
about
to.
Whitehead as a civilizational thinker and Deleuze as very uninterested in that type of a project.
Yeah.
I
Um,
don't think I would have said Deleuze was uninterested in a political project.
no, you didn't say that exactly. It was a sort of an implication.
Hmm.
Um, Maybe it's to do with what we've already spoken about. Um, see, one of my concerns though, just because I haven't opened to page 230 and this Whitehead quote, and there's a Schelling quote somewhere else that's very similar. Actually, that whole Schelling quote about the philosophy stripping away the accidents,
Hmm.
and all of that, and I'm like, oh, but yes, but how are you going to adjudicate on what's an accident and what's not? If you're going to be judging accidents in terms of accidents at a certain point.
Well,
Um,
I mean, what I read in that type of a excerpt from Schelling is exactly what you were saying about not allowing historical inheritances, which are contingent, to be reified into eternal, universal,
I agree.
metaphysical principles, and so stripping away the arbitrary and the contingent is to say, don't don't mistake the particularities of your situation for eternal principles. That's how I read that.
No, I read it in the same way, but I think then I have this issue with the use of particular terminology to describe the
Mhm.
ultimate. That's why the minimization, the
Mm.
diagrammatic approach is there. It's because if you're still in these different levels of contingency, you're saying that's the conservative trap, which I don't think Schelling fully escapes there. I had a way of speaking about it, which I now can't remember. I can't find my notes, but
Mm.
there is this is what I was getting at the end of the social contract talk. It's like, um, so Whitehead's pertinent imperative regarding the worldly responsibility of the philosophers to seek the evidence for that conception of the universe, which is the justification for the ideals characterizing the civilized phases of human society. He's saying we're seeking evidence to justify those ideals, um, as opposed to seeking evidence that those things are ideal. Um, and that's a subtle move, which I think is problematic. Because can you just you're in the way that's expressed, taking it for granted that you've already identified the ideals, and now
Mhm.
you will seek evidence for their support.
Yeah, his and he would say truth, freedom, beauty, those are the ideals that characterize what his definition of a civilized society is pursuing. And that is a judgment on his part,
Yeah,
based on what he takes to be the evidence,
yeah.
sociological evidence. We could talk about whether or not ideals like freedom, beauty, truth are ultimately, what we want to be oriented around. But I think as it
I mean, I
seems to
like
me to,
them.
yeah.
I like them. I'll grant that they're attractive. Um, but yeah, I mean, you know what I'm trying to say. Um, this is also the Schelling quote, which I just found accidentally. Humanity is not to Schelling remarks that the intention of philosophy in relation to humanity is not to add anything, but to remove from him as thoroughly as possible the accidentals that the body, the world of appearances, and the sensate life have added, and to lead him back to the originary state. Now, you have a nice gloss on this in your footnote where you say originary state may be an unhelpful translation of Schelling's term ursprünglicher, since it misleadingly freezes the fluidity of originality by describing an event as though it were a state. Bang on, and I love your gloss, but what about the rest of the essentialist language here? The accidentals. Okay, that's just standard like holomorphic way of thinking about things. There's essence and accidental variation from it. The world of appearances is right in there, which is very Platonic of him to reference it in that way. And the sensate life have added. So this is very contrary to the point of view that you're articulating and attributing to Schelling throughout much
Yeah.
of this, because you're saying that the body and the sensate life is the source of the primary, creativity, is
But it's
the
also, but that the sensate life that situates us within our embodied perspective as a particular species of organism is precisely what blinds us to the pure variation that we're striving to
yeah,
recognize as metaphysicians.
thought there were
Um,
only access to it, as we've agreed. Um, I
mhm.
agree, I agree. And you can of course give, and you have given, and you should, a much more sympathetic reading. I'm just saying that if you were going to problematize originary state, you could have also
Mhm.
equally problematized
Sure.
several
And
other.
the essence, I think, after the chapter on John Sallis, essence is the doubling of the sensible instead of the opposite of the sensible. Um, so there's context that precedes that quote that yeah, I could have drawn those connections more directly, but so there's still this language that we use, but I
Yeah,
think it's, as you're always saying, like we need new language. I agree, and we're also always needing to translate
yeah,
between the novel jargon that we might come up with
yeah,
and the
yeah.
old language to bridge, so anyone can understand what we're talking
Yeah.
about.
Totally. It's like a losing battle. It's a Sisyphean task, but we
Mhm.
still need to, as you agree, take up that task and do that metaphysical heavy lifting. And you said to me, we need to do metaphysical lifting in some of our discourse or exchange on this subject, as though I'm not advocating that we do the heaviest lifting of all. I really am.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah.
Here's another thing I just wanted to reference just for fun, because again, I just randomly opened the book and it went to this page that I was looking for. Just on Kant and anthropocentrism. Um, in the conclusion to the Critique of Practical Reason, Kant obviously has this very famous phrase a very famous passage that you reference. Two things fill the mind with ever renewing wonder and awe. The more often and the more intensely the mind is drawn to think of them, the starry heavens above me and the moral law within me. And it's like no description, of course, from the philosopher of, the sage of Königsberg, who just walked around the same streets in the same city like his entire life, of like, what is the difference between someone who says that and Darwin with his beetles? Like this is a
Mhm.
real difference. There's no, well, it's like something, okay, yeah. I mean, the starry heavens, you referenced it earlier, which is when I wanted to bring it up because you were talking about looking out and encountering the nothing and all of that. And that's why I brought it back to like the nothing is right here in some sense. But it's like there is a real difference in temperament. And we're trying, I think, to kind of, again, not synthesize them so much as walk this middle ground between there's a habitual obsession of philosophy actually with like physics and the cosmos and the mind. And it's like,
Mhm.
but what about the Beatles? You know, what about the endless variation, endless forms most beautiful that you can encounter. And it's so rare, it's so incredibly rare to encounter a philosopher who has really spent time with nature. I mean, the influx of naturalism in the your guys that you love, you know, the relation of Humboldt to the Schellings and the Novaluses and that,
Goethe.
Goethe, yeah, no, for sure. Goethe is a great example. But it's so rare to find people that have really meditated on, and I think Darwin does take it to a new level at that point as well, that kind of meditation on or contemplation of just the primacy of variation. And Peirce is the one who says these things the best in some sense, like the most obtrusive character of reality is its variability. Um, but yeah, you don't need to look at the sky. You're like, it's amazing, that's amazing. But it's just like go out and like watch critters doing things. How about you think about the 100,000, described species of Hymenopteran insect, recognize that there's probably over 1 million of them. Think about all the different ways. I mean, I could go on and on and on and on about the way they use their venom in all these different ways. And then think about the diversity of proteins present in those secretions. So, like I
Yeah.
said to you, recent estimates suggest that we have sequenced. Here, I have to say this. I'm sorry. I know we need to end, but um, there are like 300, 400,000 synthetic chemicals that we've made. And sometimes people say there are more synthetic chemical species than, nature made. And this is like a really wild claim. In the online databases for just proteins, but proteins are probably the most diverse form of chemical. I mean, I don't want to say these things absolutely, but we say we know there are like 12,000 little organic molecules or so, right? And maybe that's the comparison people are making. I don't know. Um, Protein databases currently have around 250 million sequences in them, right? Um, Now, the likelihood is that a lot of those are artifactual. There are a lot of sequencing errors. So maybe if half of them are artifactual, there's 125 million legit protein sequences. Recent estimates suggest that this is between zero point 0.1 and 0.001 of a percent of all of the protein forms that exist. So that 125 million is as little as 0.001 of a percent of all the proteins that exist. Now it's going to depend on how you define, you know, individuality or distinctness, right? There are protein family. There are lots of ways you can group things. But if you are at the bare proteoform, bare particularity, you're going to be talking about billions and billions and billions of unique proteins out there in the world. And all I'm trying to say is that yes, the starry heavens and the moral law, amazing. But it's like, have you ever meditated on how many proteins there are?
Yeah, well, I hear you here defending, and I'm speaking in, generalizations, but the Aristotelian view, I mean, it's not actually the um, Death of Socrates painting, but a much earlier painting from Raphael uh, of the School of Athens, right, where Plato's pointing up.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Aristotle has his hand like as if to say that the earth and the forms are in the particulars rather than
Yeah.
in the universal. And so you're making the Aristotelian gesture to say, hey, let's look at the mesoscale
Mm,
and the empirical.
yeah.
And certainly, Aristotle has his Platonic residues that both of us want to dissolve. But still, though, the Platonic obsession with astronomy and the problem of the planets, which is formative for it's the seed out of which science later, modern science would later flower. Um, this search for a more harmonious form of order than what the senses first would present to us, and the contrast between the invariance of the fixed
Mm,
stars and the variance of the wandering planets. Um, as the that tension between invariance and variation
mm.
um, is the slingshot that leads to the scientific
Yeah,
revolution, thousands
yeah.
of years later. And so astronomy is not like it's not a surprise that the obsession with the
No,
sky
no,
would be so generative, though we certainly do need to pay more attention to the realm of life and the middle term that
yeah,
mediates, between the moral law within and the starry heavens above.
no, completely agree. 100%, and beautifully said as always. I'm merely pointing about a kind of very recent, even though you've referenced Aristotle and all of that, but a kind of shift in our, because we were talking about science and um, how it doesn't account for or can't account for the particular, but is in fact somehow grounded in the particular. Um, and we're really talking about the position that we're articulating. And there's a lot of like, oh, well, the Neoplatonists were already saying that, and oh, Aristotle was already saying that, or actually Anaximander with the Apeiron or whatever. Those are all incredibly important, intellectual precursors that we inherit from, and blah blah blah, giants standing on their shoulders, the usual shtick. But there's something very particular that happens and begins happening in the I mean, there's a genealogy one can give of it, which I think is as good as any, in the late 18th century. And this is with the emergence of the sciences of biology, well, embryology, and geology. And, you can tell a story and it's a bit Whiggish, centered around like individual geniuses or whatever, where this reaches a certain kind of apotheosis in Darwin, which is the fusion of naturalism, embryology, and geology. Um, these are sciences of history. But what we can say is that this historical perspective has an immediate impact on all of thought, even in the late 18th century. Because what is Kant reading when Kant, it's embryology is a huge
Yep.
influence on Kant, even for the first critique. So it helps to spur the critical turn. Then what kind of feedback does Kant get from the likes of Herder and Myman and others? It's like this is a theory of Genesis. You need to
Hmm.
add history more explicitly into your theory. And obviously, we know he goes some way in doing that. We then know that your mates, the German idealists, are thoroughly historical thinkers and also in pretty close engagement with the very close engagement with the science of their times and the historical turn in science.
Yep.
What's the impact of Darwin? What about the impact of Darwin on physics? The statistical turn in physics, the transition from thermodynamics to statistical mechanics, and the account for the reality of irreversible structure, or irreversible process, in physics itself, quite inspired not only by Darwin. Boltzmann would talk about Darwin, but it's inspired by the rise of statistics in general as well, which Darwin is also inspired by.
Yeah. And
Um,
Philip Esposito makes a great argument in his book on Schelling that this lineage goes back to what Schelling was doing in his understanding of the dynamic,
yeah,
the potencies of nature and this evolutionary process of a seeking equilibrium that can never be achieved, and the way that this spills out. It's in Schelling very schematic and still at the level of analogy and metaphor for the most part, but it's, I think, quite generative for what would later become the study of far from equilibrium thermodynamics. I mean, it's quite well known, his influence on Faraday and eventually Maxwell in developing electromagnetism. And so where this evolutionary lineage of evolutionary thought begins and where the inflection points are. I mean, obviously Darwin plays such a crucial role, but without Goethe and Humboldt
I
and
agree.
Natura philosophy, I don't know that you get the Darwinian
I
uh,
mentioned
breakthrough.
those guys were in my story.
Yeah, yeah. Right. But
Neglect.
where's the crucial, like, I feel like Darwin is way too mechanistic, even though there are elements in his thought that subvert mechanism. I often would want to go back even earlier than Darwin to avoid the mechanistic residues that I still feel that are present in his thought. And there are certainly things in Goethe and Schelling
Yeah.
and Humboldt that need to be overcome too, other kinds of residues. But, you know, I think for you as a biologist, I get why Darwin is so central. And for me as a philosopher, I see Darwin inheriting ideas that I find central, that he didn't originate, but that he applies in a more empirical context in a brilliant way. Um,
Darwin is very much the man of his times, and of course, we there are lots of Anglophone influences that would be obviously Paley, but his grandfather Erasmus Darwin, and like Absolutely. And I think that I love Robert Richards' book on Darwin's debt to, the romantics. And he's obvious, very key, like Humboldt was a very key inspiration for Darwin. I very much agree with all of that. I think what Darwin does, and we've talked about this before, is that he actually makes the science of the particular possible. That's where I'm going with this in
Mm,
a sense, right?
mm,
Like Darwin basically says, actually, you need to ground everything in particularity. And in fact, the only reason that that you can have a statistical science of generals is because of the primacy of particularity. That's what he gives, which I'm not sure if that's you know as present in those earlier thinkers. And I also think that is the anti-mechanism. So there, of course, Darwin has mechanistic aspects to his thought, but precisely what he's saying is this excess. Like, we would now have to do a genealogy. I did it in my biophilosophy talk of mechanism and effective theory, to understand why I'm saying what I'm saying. But Darwin is saying excess comes first. That generative primary variation comes before the mechanical effective theorization, basically. He's
yeah,
not saying it in those terms. He's not a philosopher of science and he's not a metaphysician, but that's what he's showing. He
yeah.
does
And
it.
I
He's
just I would just say that the Darwin's treatment of that um, of particularity is so brilliant that it elided and covered over the work that the German idealist thinkers and the German natural philosophers like Schelling and Goethe and others did around form and morphology and actually even embryology where and development, where I think what ends up happening after Darwin is a real emphasis on um, the phylogenesis and less on ontogenesis. And
I
and
agree.
yeah,
I agree. You're right. It's not that Darwin neglects those things. Let's just be clear, because he
the
talks.
what but what happens after him, I think, because of
Yeah,
how
yeah.
brilliant natural selection is as an account of speciation, ontogenesis gets lost in the wake of Darwin.
Well, it's like it's again low-hanging fruit. So if we go back to the notion, I mean, that you articulated beautifully about astronomy and the origin of science, there was a certain low-hanging fruit. There were certain regularities that were relatively easily detectable and that we could, start to build a kind of scientific approach around. So Darwin, with his particular innovation, he makes the grounding of certain kind of explanation in a notion of fundamental, quote unquote, variation tractable for science, and people then run with that, right? And Boltzmann, I mean, it's there in statistics anyway, but Boltzmann shows how to formalize it in a certain way. So Boltzmann has his Stosselen-Satz, his posit of molecular chaos, and he shows how this primary variation. I mean, there's a whole complex story to tell about the nature of entropy and all these things. We don't not going to get into that, and whether it's completely observed.
Does Boltzmann explicitly credit Darwin with providing that insight, or is that a connection you're making? Or
No, he doesn't he talks about Darwin a bunch, yeah, and he
mm,
uses terms taken from Origin of Species in terms of when he's reaching for analogies instead of
mm,
going for like theological analogies, he reaches for these sorts of Darwinian analogies. When he's
mm,
actually developing his formalisms and publishing them, he doesn't mention Darwin, but he talks about Darwin in quite a number of places, right, and signals his inspiration. I mean,
mm.
Maxwell and Gibbs are doing the same similar things at the same time, and they're not explicitly referencing Darwin anywhere that I'm aware of. But um, really, what I wasn't actually trying to, I mean, it's a bit of a trigger point if I say Darwin is whatever. I was trying to articulate a trend that is very recent, really, which is the bringing of history back into science, the bringing of variation and then irreversibility and like real ontogenesis in the generic sense, not as opposed to like, we can say ontophylogenesis like Jean-Jacques Cupiec does, but we just say ontogenesis in Simondon's terms, scale
Mm.
free, right? The genesis of being, um, that trajectory. And then, Darwin obviously has a huge impact, just as I said, it was Whiggish, just as a guy there at a particular time. And again, to your point, what he gives is an opportunity for kind of formalizing, although he's not a formal thinker, and mechanizing a certain account. So it's an opportunity for doing that, even though what's then neglected is the fact that this is the anti-mechanical ground of mechanism. It's because he shows mechanism how mechanism can get purchase by making use of what is outside of it, that you get this whole flowering of mechanistic biology as a result, right? And I just feel like that genial, it hasn't been properly understood what's really going on there for the most part. And then you get the like the neo-Darwinian turn where they actually try to identify a privileged level of variation. So they try to fully mechanize variation, which we know is now a failure. But that was not Darwin's notion anyway. So there's like a lot of devils in the details there. But I just wanted to move on through Darwin, through, pragmatism, through process philosophy, um, through to post-structuralism. And, Deleuze is an interlocutor here, but obviously, the people who lead to post-structuralism like Canguilhem and Bachelard and Simondon and all these others. And there is this, and now we're in this situation in contemporary biology where we feel like we're on this, this paradigm shift, and what can physicalist formalisms account for and what can't they? And some people are reaching back to Plato and all this kind of stuff. And it's like, this is just this history, which if we're going to tell it, of course you can go all the way back to Plato and beyond, as I said, but we can tell it as an intervention in the late 18th century, and the way all of these thinkers have tried to understand Genesis and time, basically time as construction. And yeah, it is a peculiarly modern and recent way of thinking about things, and that's the crest that we are particularly riding here in these discussions, I think. And
Yeah.
that's sort of why we need a thought, because now also we have so much more, um, obviously empirical data, whatever, like Darwin surely didn't know there were billions of proteins. Um, we also have so much more technical acumen in the development of like post-evolutionary physics, like the statistical turn in physics, and that leads to quantum mechanics and like cybernetics and complexity theory, and all of that is all downstream of that statistical turn, which I'm saying is kind of downstream of like Darwin. Um,
Hmm.
we've got so much work to do, not to just think these things in terms of old classical images. That's not what I'm saying you're doing at all, but you know what I mean. Like
Yeah.
there can be a tendency to do that.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, I think it's not Whitehead who put it exactly this way, but basically he's affirmed the sentiment that biology will teach us a new physics, uh, and that
or
biology will.
even
What?
before Whitehead already has, even before Whitehead's time, would be
Sure.
my rejoinder. But yes, 100%. It still needs to continue doing so.
Yeah, and this is what Schrodinger thought. Um, uh, this is what you know was at when Schrodinger does his What is Life lectures, he's got the sense that whatever like quantum physics was opening up this, it was a realization that the reductionist understanding of the physical world wasn't going to work, and that we might now need to turn to the living world to better understand what a body is capable of, to use Spinoza's terms. Um, yeah.
No, absolutely. And again, I just think this is often it's sort of misunderstood, right? That, physicalists are often like, we don't need new physics. We've identified all the forces. Look, those new forces haven't shown up in experiments. Um, and it's a total misunderstanding. And I think it's why we need to tell, obviously, in some significant detail, this history
Hmm.
um, of the kind of historical and statistical and all these turns and the way biology is bound up in that, so that we can then, in the current moment, really understand what it means for biology to continue. Like biology takes a huge amount from physics. Nobody's going to deny that. But as opposed to thinking of physics as the reduction base of biology, which is the classical or the standard view, um, what is biology has been teaching physics, and what biology can continue to teach physics, and why when we have, physicists and philosophers talking to each other and going like, what is the relationship between physics and mind? Um, what about the generative middle ground? But also physicists who have no real biological intuitions, sorry to say it, talking about like rediscovering evolution, like computational physics. You don't think computation is an evolutionary process? Um, you know, all of this sort of stuff, like physics becoming more constructivist in a sense, physics as a resource theory, which is
Yeah.
something we'll talk about a lot more because it's part of something we're working on together, I hope. Um, it's very much in keeping with all the discussions that we've been having. But it's like again, life, putting life right there in the center, and those intuitions and methods for sure, but intuitions almost more than methods, um, that have been developed in biological context through that very, very direct empirical encounter with non-human life. Um, you know, those I think are incredibly relevant to all these big questions and generally neglected.
Mm. Yeah. Well, I think we better leave it there.
I think so.
I'm really yeah, grateful to you again for spending some time with my writing, and I think this was a really generative conversation, and more work to be done. I think again, I'll just reiterate, there's way more. I have a sense of convergence and a softening of any of the sticking points, but I'm sure they'll re-emerge in our WhatsApp thread, and we can get back to refining uh, those points of tension because they're important. But again, as I've said, I really feel like where we do disagree, we're performing a tension of opposites that's present in the real itself. And so both of us trying to affirm a form of constructive realism are inevitably, uh, I would think if we're doing it honestly and rigorously, we're going to end up performing that uh, the polarity between the real and the ideal, the polarity between the possible and the actual, the
Mm,
variant and the invariant, so
mm.
I take this as a signal that we're doing something right.
I agree. I
Um,
agree. I love your writing, Matt, and I've read a lot of your writing, as you know. And I read your, Physics of the World Soul book before I even met you. Um, so, yeah, I welcome the opportunity to engage with your stuff. We are, of course, coming from slightly different backgrounds, so we're always going to have, slightly different, ways of understanding things. I mean, even one thing I'll say, just to inject some generative ten, I mean, I should say, yes, of course, we agree on so much, and I think that's always been apparent. That's why we spend so much time talking to each other. I mean, if we just disagreed on everything, it wouldn't be generative. It's so generative because we share so much that we can get very fine grained sometimes. On polarities, there are two different options here. Like, is the polarity primordial? Does it have to be? Or is it actually, in the Simondonian terms, an emergent polarity? Because there is the generative middle ground that the polarity represents the extreme terms thereof. And that's this again, this distinction between a slight emphasis on the particularity or pure variation or whatever as primary versus this stabilized, rational, intelligible structure of
it's just
opposites.
typically the rationalists want to prefigure this as a prior unity, and I'm denying that you can actually successfully articulate that you're always already in the polarity. And when you talk
Mhm.
about a pre-individual or a pure
Mhm.
variation, a metastability prior to the polarization, you don't mean to figure that as unity, certainly, like
But
the rationalist would, right? And I
this,
don't, I'm resisting pure variation as the um, you wouldn't say the fundamental, but as the primordial, because I think it just variation presupposes invariance as the background in terms of which we make sense of such a concept. Um, and I know variation in the way that you're meaning it is not a concept. It's like the surd or given the givenness before there is conceptual reflection. Like I get all of that, but at this level, uh, a part of the logic of imagination that's at the core of my whole book is the sense that, we're always going to be dealing with polarities. Um, but obviously I'm not a dualist. Polarization is not duality. Polarity
they're,
is not
they're,
duality.
they're operational
Yeah.
polarities.
And they mutually presuppose one another. They're not defined as separate substances that require nothing but themselves in order to exist,
Yeah, yeah. No,
Um,
and I love where you went with that. I guess the whole point of trying to think the if you want to say the primordial, and again, we've talked about how it's similar to just a basic posit and all of these sorts of things. It doesn't need to necessarily be the primordial in some, you know, creation myth type sense, although it is that too, analogically. Um, the whole point of trying to think that to the hilt is saying that both unity and polarity cannot, be primary, right? Cannot be ultimate. But it is that encounter of the limit. So it's the singularity, not in the sense of the um, discrete, individual, absolutely individual thing, the particularity in a certain sense. It's the singularity as the point at which the system collapses. It's the singularity at the point at which we have hit the boundaries of our domain. So I think that the polarity is the boundary of the domain in some sense, right? Like is how you define a domain. Like
Mm.
whereas the disunity that is beyond that, that's outside the domain always.
Yeah.
Something like
I yeah, I mean, I guess you're as much as I affirm radical empiricism in James's sense, I think throughout my book, I'm also trying to hold this polarity between rationalism and empiricism. I
yeah,
think you're much more on the empiricist side, whereas I'm trying to say, the I want to hold that tension and not
yeah.
just say the rationalists are wrong about everything. And I'm not saying you're saying that, but I
No, no,
do
no.
I do seem like, and I think you would agree that I'm more inclined to want to say, hey, there's something in the rationalist and the idealist and the Platonist orientation that's not wrong.
Oh, but I
Um,
agree. I do agree. But what's going to be paradoxical in what I'm doing, or seem paradoxical, is that I'm actually on the other side in some sense, where I'm recuperating effective theory. So I'm very structural, like I'm a structural realist about science, and I'm like, yeah, all that stuff gets a lot right. So there's a lot of tendency in the sort of idealist or certain circles, let's say, not necessarily idealist, but to kind of throw that away, or something, where, and I mean, I of course think that the idealists have a great deal that's right, and in fact I think that effective theory is idealism.
mm,
Like, physicalism is rationalism, and I'm not dustbinning that, I'm just relativizing it. So I mean, we're
mm.
doing it's the same kind of move, but I am trying to recuperate effective theory by showing what it presupposes. And I am saying, and I find sometimes anyway that this is a point that's contrary to some philosophers that I speak to. I'm saying, like, instrumentalism itself, like the instrumental purchase that an effective theory gives you, like its efficacy, its effectiveness, is in fact a measure of its truth, essentially, right? Um,
Well, pragmatism, right? I
yeah,
mean,
well, exactly.
mhm,
But yeah, I'm saying that these things get something profoundly right about the world. Like the FEP as effective theory of effective theorization is getting something really correct and is really useful in that regard, but it simply mustn't be confused with an ultimate because it has no account of its own genesis. It has no
mhm,
account of the genesis of the boundary of the Markov blanket, so to speak, right? I mean,
mm.
Carl will gesture towards Jeremy England and dissipative adaptation, or Hermann Haken and synergetics, and I've been there, and I can see like the same problem exists in those accounts. Um, and again, here there is the difference between the empirical and the formal aspects, because anyway, there's too much to say. I do think that the so I will preserve the truths of rationalism, absolutely. But yes, I think that empiricism always exceeds rationalism, would be the way I would put it.
Yeah.
The empirical, because it's just what you encounter, you know, is
I
always
I would say with again in broad terms, without the rationalists, there'd be no concept of truth for us to move towards. And the empiricists are important for always reminding us to never fool ourselves into thinking we've arrived at the truth. Uh,
no, I think that's absolutely right as a kind of, like, that's history of philosophy stuff, and that's absolutely right. But all organisms have a sense of aptness, not truth with a capital T, and like I'm going to say something silly, like if I bang my head on this table, I will be convinced of the truth of its hardness. Like primary truth, so to speak. primary is just there in the encounter with the world already. So there's a certain not in the meditation on firstness per se, but in our encounter with the world long before we had like rationalism as a philosophical doctrine. But then I will say again, and I need to shut up because I'm freaking exhausted. Um, life is effective theorization. This is what the FEP gets right, but doesn't. I mean, it does say it in some places, like, is a map of that part of reality that itself makes maps. Like that's essentially the idea here, right? As they say in the Bayesian mechanics paper. Um, life is always in like solving the frame problem is generating an effective theory that is satisficing, that is good enough for whatever you need to do right now. um, but it's that ongoing, not once and forever. This is Simondon and vital individuation being this ongoing process, which Stenger's also actually gets wrong. uh, um, that's a totally different subject. It's continually ongoing. It's always the genesis of a variation on that effective theory, and the effective theoretic paradigm, as formalized, can't actually account for that. Like it can nest, it nests really well. Like that's what physics kind of, or the physicalist approach to natural science is a nested hierarchy of effective theories, but it's not self-grounding. It can't ground itself. It has to begin with an identification of a set of fundamental variables or fundamental invariants in terms of which variation can be defined, which is exactly what you just said. That's the rationalist move. That's the essentialist move of Aristotle, characters like scholastic Aristotle, um, of accidental variation, accidental deviation from, invariant species essence. And that's again what I'm just saying. Darwin, and maybe he's not the first. He's obviously not the first. Pre-Socratics already thought this, but he's inverting that, and that's an important move to me.
Yeah.
That's where empiricism always exceeds rationalism. Um,
Yeah. And rationalism always provides empiricism with a way of remaining oriented towards truth, right?
yeah,
Truth is an idea. Truth is not a fact. You'll never find truth empirically, but truth can be the ideal that drives empirical inquiry, right? It's
yeah. And I definitely, I mean, I'm not going to argue that point because I think absolutely, I think the rational has an incredibly huge role, and I think all organisms are rational. In this,
just like uh our friend Margaret Cavendish, who I was talking to you about earlier. Yeah.
absolutely, absolutely, I love that passage that you shared from her. Yeah.
Yeah.
Um, no, I'll shut
Let's
up.
um I know you're exhausted, but I feel like you were incredibly articulate, and I'll look forward to reading the transcript of this, and I think it will really help us move forward with our shared inquiry and collaboration.
Absolutely.
So
And
thank you, Tim.
thank you, Matt. And I've got a visitor, as you know, and that thing that I'm working on for us is going to have to be
Nope,
completed after.
it's okay.
And when you read that transcript, don't forget that those AI schmucks always get shit wrong, and often in a way that completely inverts the meaning. So just be aware.
I I won't just share a transcript without reading it very carefully. And this 3 hour or whatever conversation will
Okay.
require some careful reading. So
I've now been on Zoom for 5 hours and 15 minutes, I think. Yeah.
well, walk the dog or something. Get out of the
And
house.
I'm going to bed. I'm going to bed at 3 in the afternoon.
All right, Tim. Well, I hope your health continues to improve. And yeah, we'll be in touch. Enjoy your company
Yeah.
and
Well,
try to avoid politics.
yeah. Take care, man. It was a
Yep.
great pleasure.
Later, Tim.